The sun had come up. Mary Alice walked down Avenue N and took a shortcut through the T-shaped alleyway. It was there that the 11-year-old girl discovered a dead body. It was a woman, lying face down. The snow around her was red. Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist. Today, David Milgaard and the murder of Gail Miller. Thank you to David who wrote today's script. If you're new here, the format of the show, I've never read this before. David has written it for me. I'm going to read it. We're going to explore it together, dear audience. Let's jump in.
Hello. Oh my god, a guy's on the floor.
It was January the 31st, 1969, in Saskatchewan, in Canada. Oh my lord, Canada. I'm pretty sure those are the correct pronunciations, because I feel like I've had to look this up before. But, yeah. It was 7 o'clock in the morning. The sky, pitch black. The sun would be up for another hour. Apart from the roads and the sidewalks, there was about 3 or 4 feet of snow on the ground. Such is life in central Canada. Most years, there's snow on the ground from October through to the end of April when the last of the muddy brown slush finally dries up and disappears. Snow, 7 months of the year. In the bad years, 8 or even 9. Oh my god, am I glad I don't live here. Like, snow's fine. Don't mind it. It's okay. But snow means it's cold. Don't like it to be cold 8 to 9 months a year. Good lord. Well, still on this particular morning in Saskatoon, it was hideously cold. Approximately minus 40 degrees the temperature, where both Celsius and Fahrenheit meet to touch toes. I remember that. I learned this from an episode of Stargate SG-1, where they go through the Chopper Eye. The Stargate. And they... Oh my god, this is so nerdy. And it puts them in like an ice cave on some planet, and Samantha Carter says like, it's minus 39 in here, and Jack O'Neill's like, what, minus 39 Celsius or Fahrenheit? She's like, well, actually they're both the same. And I'm like, whoa, I'm learning science. Frostbitten toes. A 20-year-old nursing assistant, dressed in a white uniform under a thick fur-lined coat, stepped out from the boarding house where she lived into the cold and darkness of the winter morning. Her auburn hair cut into a neat 1960s bob, because this is 1969, after all, and was covered by a blue wool toque. 2K. David gives me the pronunciation guide. Just before we continue with the video today, let me give a shout out to our wonderful sponsor there. That is our good friends over at Vessi, who appropriately right now, it is absolutely pouring with rain outside. I'm wearing my, I'll be honest right now, I'm not actually wearing any shoes. I'm just in the office in my socks. But I think I'm actually going to put on these Vessi Stormbursts before I head to my car, which is also so far away. They were cleaning the street. I had to park my car on a different street, so I was like 10 minutes walk away. But, well, look, back to the sponsor. I got my Vessis, so my feet are going to be fine. I've even got an umbrella, so I'm going to be so fine. Brilliant. Vessis are 100% waterproof. They use a material which is Dymatex, but I call it magic. You can go up to here in your Vessis, and, it will keep all of the water out. Your socks will stay dry. They also look cool. They're Ravader's kind of I can't remember what this is called. It's like a charcoal grey colour. Do they say the colour in here? No. But you know what grey looks like. It looks great. They also do this. I think I've got black. I've got a white pair of these for sure. Look, whatever you're up to, get a pair of Vessis. Like I say, they're waterproof, they're super light, and just ultra comfortable. Just the best shoes you'll ever wear since they started sponsoring. It's basically all I've been wearing. So, if you're ready to try any terrain, rain or shine, try the Vessi Stormburst today. It's 100% waterproof, backed by a 1-year guarantee, and risk-free with 30-day returns. Shop now at vessi.com/TCC. You'll get 15% off your first pair. And now back to today's episode. The weather that day was vile, but it was just a short walk to the bus stop. The bus would be heated, as it stopped right in front of Saskatoon City Hospital, where she worked in the pediatric ward. Known for being a kind young woman with a gentle soul, she had always wanted to work with children. Her name was Gail Miller. I'm sorry for a really boring aside, but I just have to share something about, like, I live in Prague, the winters get real cold, and I used to live in an apartment in the city, and I'd take my kids to school and we'd go on the tram. And it was like a 5-minute walk to the tram. And I remember being, it's so cold, I don't like walking to the tram. And now I live in a house and I drive them to school, or I used to. Now they go to a different school, which is more convenient for my wife to drive them. Anyway, it's just like quick hustle to the car. The car's already warm because I set up that timer thing. Need to get in the car and yell, yes. Minimal time outside. Originally from the tiny farming village of Laura, Saskatchewan, 52 kilometers or 32 miles southwest of Saskatoon, population 100. That's like what? It's like 10 families. Oh, not 10, 20 families. What's going on? Gail Miller was the second of 9 children. Oh my, in that case, never mind. It is 10 families. What are you up to, Saskatchewan? Her family struggled to make ends meet after... Wait. I'm sorry, I know there's like so many boring asides, and none of you know what I'm struggling with here. Wait, when you say make ends meet, I'm going to assume David's right because he's got a giant brain compared to me and is a writer and knows how to use words. I thought ends meet was about the ends of the meat. So like if you've got like a nice cut of something, then the end bits are like all fatty or gristly, and those would be cut off, and that was the ends meet. So that was like the cheaper part, so you could make ends meet, enough meat to get by. Not 2 ends, M-E-E-T. Right? Hey, ChatGPT, my dude. When you say ends meet, is it M-E-E-T or M-E-A-T? David's going to be right.
Eddie Simon, it's ends meet as in M-E-E-T. The phrase is all about making the ends of your budget come together so that everything balances out financially. No meat involved.
Wait, I thought there was something about the end of the meat. You know, like you've got a cut of meat and the end bit's not very good. So like that's what poorer people would buy.
Yeah, I can totally see how that could sound like a logical origin. It's one of those phrases that definitely could have had a meat mace backstory in another universe. But yeah, in this case, it's just about making your financial ends meet.
Oh my God, of course David's right. I've thought my whole life it's just about the end bits of the meat. After finishing high school, Gail was looking at the prospect of an early marriage to a farmer somewhere in the community, and then life's traditional cycle would begin anew. Gail having like 17 children. But Gail's grandmother offered to pay for her to train as a nursing student in Saskatoon. Gail jumped at the chance. She arrived at a modest city of 120,000 people, but it might as well have been New York compared to where she grew up. Yeah, I used to live in a city of a couple 100,000 people, and moving there from a village of 100, like I grew up in a small-ish village, but way more than 100, and then moving to a city of that big, you're like, whoa, there's so much stuff. You've got like more than 2 restaurants. Her boyfriend Les still lived in Laura. I feel like there's a that's what she said joke there. And would occasionally drive up to visit Gail. Gail was said to have loved him dearly. The young woman lived in a dingy room in a boarding house in a neighborhood of Pleasant Hill with some other nursing students. Doesn't sound very pleasant at all, does it? She hated the place and kept telling her friends and colleagues that she'd move out at the earliest opportunity. Because the boarding house contained nurses, it was often visited by the occasional horny young man hoping to shoot their shot. Usually these tactless visitors were met with rejection, but sometimes it was more sinister. In December 1968, Gail caught a peeping Tom staring in her window. She was terrified. She told her nursing friends that if she was ever seriously attacked, she would rather die than allow herself to be, I'm not going to say this word, so 7 minutes into today's episode, but the R word, and not the learning disability one, the other one. Obviously, Simon. Everyone knows what you're talking about. Shut the fuck up. On the morning of January the 31st, 1969, Gail woke up at around 6 a.m. She had only gotten about 3 hours sleep. Gail and her friends in the boarding house had stayed up late the night before, talking and laughing and drinking a little alcohol. Gail got dressed and immediately set about fixing her hair and makeup in the mirror, skipping breakfast. Gail's friends knew her to be highly fastidious about her appearance, which she kept immaculate. She had a pleasant, pixie-like, almost mischievous face with clear blue eyes that shone with a sort of natural intelligence. She was barely above 5 feet tall, but was by no means frail. Having grown up in the countryside, she was robust and muscular. I grew up in the countryside. I'm extremely robust, man. I am quite muscular these days. I still in my mind, because I started working out like a couple of years ago, I'm still not very muscular in my mind, but I guess I am these days, so the joke doesn't really land that well anymore. One of Gail's housemates saw her by the door of the boarding house just before 7 a.m., putting on her Tukey, snow boots, and winter coat. In order to get to work, Gail usually caught a bus a block and a half away from the boarding house on the corner of 20th Street and Avenue O. Her bus would arrive at around 7:10 a.m. with frequent delays of about 5 minutes due to the snowy weather. From there, it was a short ride to the hospital where Gail would begin her shift at 7:30. As Gail Miller walked down the sidewalk on 21st Street, a car containing 3 teenagers pulled up alongside her. A teenage boy poked his head out and asked Gail if she knew of a house somewhere called Peace Hill, where another teenage boy named Shorty Cadrain lived. Gail shook her head no and kept walking. All right, yeah, you'd be like, yo, Gail, yo, woman, nurse, dressed as nurse, yo, where's Shorty? In order to shave a minute or two off her journey to the corner of Avenue O and 20th, Gail turned down a T-shaped alleyway that connected 21st Street, Avenue O, and Avenue N with 3 exits. It properly lit on that winter morning, the alleyway was dark. Gail had previously told her friends how she loathed going to work in the dark as it made her nervous. Suddenly, the alleyway was lit up by the headlights of a car. A vehicle had followed her down there from 21st Street. Gail turned around to look at it. A male figure got out of the driver's side door, quickly ran up to Gail, and grabbed her. The attacker held a 3.5-inch paring knife to her throat. He dragged her into the car, with one of Gail's boots slipping in the process. There is evidence that Gail fiercely resisted. 15 shallow lacerations on Gail's neck and upper chest indicate that she struggled to break free, and the knife slipped as she did so. She was also found with her wrist still tightly clenched and deeply bruised. Gail Miller had put up a fight. Once they were in the car, the male assailant R-worded her. Gail likely continued to struggle throughout the violent assault. The attacker stabbed Gail 4 times in the chest, 4 times in the back, 3 times around the collarbone, and once in the side, a total of 12 stab wounds. 2 of them punctured her right lung, causing it to collapse. She began to bleed rapidly and went into shock. The assailant pushed her out of the car, dumped her in the alleyway. He then threw the car into reverse and fled the scene, and it was there in the alleyway, lying in the snow, that Gail Miller died. At 7:30 a.m. in the pediatric ward at Saskatoon City Hospital, nurse Vicky Lynn Fontaine began her shift. She was expecting to see Gail Miller at any minute. An hour went by. She began to worry. She later said, quote, "It was unusual because you don't just not show up and not phone." At 8:25 a.m., 11-year-old Mary Alice Marcoux stepped out of the front door of her house and began a short 4-block journey to St. Mary's Elementary School. By herself? Wait, I suppose I did walk to the bus stop by myself at 11. I'm just wondering, it's hard to know because, it's interesting. I got kids. One is almost 6 and one is almost 4. And, it's my son's birthday really soon. It's like in 2 weeks. Okay. And it's hard. I can imagine any child below that age. I can be like, that child is 3. That child is 2. But then any child older, someone would be like, how old's that child? I'd be like, I don't know, 12. I'd be like, that's 14. I'd be like, oh, okay. I guess I'll know when my kids get there. The sun had come up. Mary Alice walked down Avenue N and took a shortcut through the T-shaped alleyway. It was there that the 11-year-old girl discovered a dead body. It was a woman, lying face down. The snow around her was red. As Mary Alice stood there wondering what to do, a 9-year-old boy, Matthew Natiuk, came walking down the alleyway. He also saw the body. Mary Alice told him to run home and get his mother. Meanwhile, the traumatized young girl stood in silent vigil over the corpse. Within 2 minutes, the boy's mother had arrived, having run hell for leather from her home. Mrs. Natiuk quickly glanced at the body and told Mary Alice to go to the nearby Westwood Funeral Home and to stay there until she fetched her. Mrs. Natiuk then returned home and dialed 911. The call went out over Saskatoon Police Radio at 8:40 a.m. Get shorty. I already made that joke, David. There we go. Nice. Simon, what the fuck are you doing? You just talk. It's one of those things where it's like, oh, this is so horrible. It's like an 11-year-old discovering a body of a woman who's been sexually assaulted and stabbed. And you're like, oh, now's the time for a get shorty joke. It's just because it's so grim, you know? When officers arrived, they discovered the body of Gail Miller had been covered with a blue blanket. The assistant manager at the Westwood Funeral Home had tried to give the young woman some dignity in death. Detectives John Parker and George Reed were the first on the scene. Parker pulled back the blanket. Gail Miller lay on her face, her arms under her. Her 2K and one of her snow boots were missing. Her hair was matted, having been soaked in blood, which quickly froze beneath her and all around her for about 1 foot down into the snow. It was saturated red. Over the next hour, an additional 30 officers arrived and secured the scene. Everything was photographed, though the mechanical camera struggled to function in minus 40-degree weather. Well, I guess on the plus side, that, it's not like anything's going to decompose or anything. You got plenty of time. It's minus 40. How long does it take something to freeze solid in minus 40? It can't be that long. When they turned over Gail Miller's body, police saw that her fur coat was open, that her top was crumpled above her waist, and that her skirt and undergarments had been pulled down to her thighs. The woman's uniform and badge quickly led police to Saskatoon City Hospital to identify the victim. Police discovered the murder weapon underneath Miller's body, the blade of a 3.5-inch paring knife. Paring knife? Paring knife, right? For, paring knife, the little knife they used to chop vegetables. Under the force of the attack, the blade had broken off from its handle, which was nowhere to be found. Unsurprisingly, the victim's wounds were later found to be consistent with this blade. No Sherlock. Police also found the victim's boots slightly submerged under a thin layer of snow. The perpetrator had left no fingerprints. He had worn gloves, if not out of caution, then certainly because of the weather, and because of the fact that it was -40, the snow was so brittle that it did not retain clear footprints, nor a detailed impression of the tire treads of the assailant's car. Police canvassed the neighborhood. Nobody had seen or heard the attack. Yeah, 69's also way before DNA. The autopsy that afternoon revealed that the victim had been cut 15 times and stabbed 12. Inside the vaginal canal, there was residue of semen. However, there was no sign of tearing or trauma. This was likely because the victim had already gone into shock from the stab wounds by the time the assailant had begun to attack her. Over the past several months, 14 women across Saskatoon have been sexually assaulted, including 2 women in the same neighborhood of Pleasant Hill. This is a town of 100,000 people, 14 sexual assaults? I don't want to ranking sexual assaults, proper sexual assaults, but violence is probably the correct word to use, right? Is these violent? Is all sexual assault is violent? What are you saying, Simon? Use your brain. But I mean, this is murder. So it's a lot of assault going on. Stop digging yourself a bloody hole. The perpetrator or perpetrators remained unidentified. In both the Pleasant Hill cases, the attacker had threatened the women with a knife. In addition, a few years earlier, a nurse had been murdered and dumped by a riverbank. The case remained unsolved. It was possible that they had a serial predator in the area. On February 3rd, 1969, the police made a press release confirming Gail Miller's identity and the fact that she had been stabbed, but strangely, and perhaps unethically, in order to avoid widespread public panic, police outright lied that she had not been R-worded. They repeatedly and emphatically insisted on this point. I mean, there is a point though, police, where it's maybe the public should be panicking just a little bit because, of all the R-wording that's going on. What the perhaps unethically? Yeah, maybe. In the first 3 days after the murder, people in the neighborhood began to find items thrown into their backyards and near their trash cans. A pair of surgical scissors matching those used at a Saskatoon City hospital, the keys to Gail Miller's boarding house, and a handle to a paring knife with the blade snapped off. Again, there were no fingerprints. Police followed garbage trucks around the area to inspect the trash before it could be collected and taken to the dump. They discovered that Gail Miller's purse had been tossed in a trash can at a house on 20th Street. It was clear that after the murder, the perpetrator had realized that he'd still got a lot of Gail Miller's things in his car, and he tried to dispose of them as he drove across the neighborhood away from the scene. What are you doing? You gotta burn that, dude. Obviously. On February the 4th, Lieutenant Joe Pencala returned to the T-shaped alleyway in Pleasant Hill after paying a follow-up visit to the Westwood funeral home. While looking at the murder scene, Pencala spotted 2 lumps of yellowish snow where Gail Miller's body had lain. Although they were likely dog urine, Pencala bagged them anyway and took them to the police station to put them in the freezer. The forensics lab determined that the snow contained additional amounts of semen in such quantities that they'd be able to determine blood type. Oh, I didn't. Okay, 1969. You're on that science already. Cool. It was 1969, so obviously DNA was a long way off, but blood type could prove useful should they find a suspect. Speaking of which, Gail Miller's boyfriend Les and her male co-workers were quickly eliminated. All had alibis and no solid motive. Additionally, most of the local scumbags in Pleasant Hill known to the police were also found to have alibis for 7 a.m. that morning. Having reached a dead end in the investigation, police offered a $2,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of a perpetrator. That's roughly $16,500 in today's money. Hundreds of tips came flooding in, some well-meaning, some paranoid, some downright crazy. Well, they were all useless. On February the 6th, 1969, 17-year-old Albert Shorty Cadrain was arrested in Regina. David says some Canadians are a bit touchy about the pronunciation of this one. Don't know why. Because the obvious pronunciation is... Regina. Wait, is it Regina? It's Regina. But yeah, you'd want to call it Regina, wouldn't you? The provincial capital of Saskatchewan for vagrancy. Oh, okay, sorry. The guy is arrested for vagrancy. It's not the capital of vagrancy. He had been loitering around drunk in public. Cadrain lived with his parents in Pleasant Hill in Saskatoon. He had spent the last few days driving around Alberta with his friends on a bender. It sounds like something like a 50-year-old man's up to, not a 17-year-old. When Saskatoon got arrested for vagrancy. When Saskatoon police heard about this, they traveled to Regina. Regina. Oh, I don't know. Whatever. I'm not even sure.
No! God, please, no! No! No!
To ask Shorty Cadrain about his movements on January the 31st, it wasn't much, but the cops weren't exactly flush with solid leads. During his interrogation, Shorty Cadrain claims that this was the first time he was hearing about the murder of Gail Miller. Police leaned hard on him, intimating that they considered him to be their prime suspect. The teenager got scared and denied to have anything to do with the murder. Cadrain stated that at 9 a.m. on the morning of the 31st, he was picked up in Pleasant Hill by 3 friends who had driven up from Regina. They then embarked on a boisterous, booze-soaked road trip across Western Canada. The gaggle of teens drove into Alberta, drank a lot, smoked some pot, and generally acted like jackasses, and then drove back to Saskatchewan, winding up in Regina. It was there that the car broke down, the group split up, and Shorty Cadrain got arrested shortly thereafter. He had no idea of the whereabouts of his 3 friends. Yeah, I kind of believe him. It's one of those alibis where it's just like, oh, it's a bit silly, isn't it? Like, I feel like you'd come up with a better alibi that didn't involve you going on like a 4-day bender. Shorty Cadrain identified his traveling companions as Ron Wilson, Nickel John, and David Milgaard. Also, he's only 17, and this sort of crime feels like the crime of someone who's got a bit more life experience and has had a chance to escalate their crimes beyond what someone would usually be able to achieve by the age of 17, right? The interrogating officers knew that they had no physical evidence connecting Shorty Cadrain to the crime scene, but they didn't let him know that. At the end of the interview, one of the officers told Cadrain that if he continued to carry on like a drunken fool, one day he'd wind up dead in the street. And that was that. The Cadrain connection didn't seem like much of a lead. A few weeks passed, and it looked like the Gail Miller murder case had turned cold. Shorty Cadrain was released from lockup after a week, and he promptly went on another series of benders. He returned to Saskatoon on March the 1st, catching an earful from his parents. 17, where have you been? It's like, oh, I went on a big bender with my mates. And yeah, we were driving, and we did drugs, and we acted like jackasses. Shorty sounds like a right douchebag, even if I don't think he's guilty of this crime. The following day, March the 2nd, Shorty Cadrain walked into a Saskatoon police station claiming to have vital information about the murder of Gail Miller. Well, that's a twist. He told Detective Eddie Cast that at 9 a.m. on January the 31st, his 3 traveling companions had shown up to his house in Pleasant Hill. One of them, David Milgaard, was covered in blood and seemed eager to get out of town. They promptly lit out for Alberta. Later that day, Cadrain saw Milgaard throw a woman's makeup case in the trash at a gas station. While the 14s were in Alberta, Cadrain observed David Milgaard acting strangely. At one point, Milgaard took Cadrain aside and drunkenly boasted that he had mafia connections and that he needed to find a gun to kill their other 2 traveling companions, Ron Wilson and Nickel John, because they knew too much. Bruh. Why are you telling? It's like, no, I got to kill the other 2 guys, but not you, Shorty. Definitely not you. You don't know too much, Shorty, right? During the interview, Shorty Cadrain requested that he be given the $2,000 reward in exchange for betraying a friend. Detective Cast reported Cadrain's testimony to his supervisor, and because there was a great deal of pressure on Saskatoon police to solve the murder, the information ran all the way up the chain and reached the ears of Chief of Police James G. Kettles. That same day, police tendrils extended far and wide to locate and question Shorty Cadrain's 3 travel companions, Ron Wilson, Nickel John, and above all, David Milgaard, a boy of just 16. Well, I guess I take it back, because previously I was like, 17-year-old can't do that sort of thing because he doesn't have enough crime experience. But this guy's 16. And he's our prime suspect, right? If we believe Shorty, but Shorty might just be in it for the money. Although the next section is apparently called Meet David Milgaard, so I get the feeling maybe not. David Edgar Milgaard was born on the 7th of July 1952 in Winnipeg, Manitoba, to parents Lorne and Joyce Milgaard. I knew a guy from Winnipeg. And he was like, yeah, everyone calls it Winterpeg and we hate that. I'm like, why? It's like, because it's really cold there. It's like winter all the time. And I'm like, well, seems appropriate then, doesn't it, mate? It's like, don't say that. It's like if you live in Winterpeg, dude, you got to just embrace that. It's cold. They would go on to have 3 more children. The family was not well off. Lorne and Joyce both worked unskilled labor jobs where they could find them, and to keep the household with 4 kids afloat. Like back in the day when you could support 4 kids with 2 jobs doing manual labor. Eventually, Lorne tried running his own restaurant, but it didn't work out. Plus, having enough money to start your own restaurant. At home, most of Lorne and Joyce's attention was spent on David's younger brothers, Chris, who had undergone brain surgery and was permanently disabled. This left David with a lot of unsupervised free time. He developed a mischievous streak, followed by a rebellious one. He was frequently getting into trouble and did not enjoy school. At age 7, he deliberately set fire to a tree house, which quickly spread to other trees in the forest. Holy dude, at 7 you started a forest fire? You pyro! He was also in the habit of shoveling hot tar from a newly laid road and flinging it onto the hood of a nearby car, destroying the paint job and warping the metal. He did this several times to the uproarious laughter of the boys he was with. David Milgaard was quite gregarious and had no difficulty making friends. The problem was keeping them. From age 10 to 13, Milgaard relocated to 4 different schools as his parents hopped from neighborhood to neighborhood in search of work. It made it difficult for Milgaard to form lasting connections with his peers. He was always the stranger, the outsider. In 1965, when Milgaard was 13, his family moved to the small farming village of Langenberg, Saskatchewan, with a population of just a few hundred people. His father had found work in a potash mine about 30 minutes away, near the tiny country town of Esterhazy. What is potash? What are you mining? I feel like I've heard of this. I want to say it's fertilizer or something, but that can't be right. You don't mine fertilizer like this, do you? The following year, at age 14, Milgaard stole a pickup truck and went on a joyride around the countryside. He was pulled over by the cops and arrested. Milgaard had always been a troublemaker, committing his first arson at the age of 7, indeed. But now he was older, and the law was involved. Lorne and Joyce were shaken. They worried that there was something seriously wrong with their son. He started a forest fire when he was 17, and he keeps ruining people's cars. So in November 1966, they had Milgaard committed to a psychiatric ward in the town of Yorkton, where he was kept under observation for 3 months. Milgaard's attending psychiatrist concluded that he did not display psychopathy or any other personality disorder, nor did he show any tendency towards violence or sexual abuse. So he's just a very, very naughty boy. Although I get the feeling that psychiatrist might be wrong. After Milgaard was released in January 1967, he was packed off to boarding school for troubled teens, where he promptly failed every subject, experimented with marijuana and LSD, and ran away several times. I suppose it was the 60s. In July 1967, he returned home to Langenberg for the summer. Shortly after his 15th birthday, Milgaard took off for good. He hitchhiked to Regina, and from there travelled all across Canada, meeting new people and scratching out a living wherever he could. Here is where Milgaard's story gets a bit dark. What we do know is that he left home as the Summer of Love of 1967 was in full swing. I thought the Summer of Love was 1969. Was there more than one Summer of Love? It was the summer of 69, isn't that, Brian Johnson?
That is not correct.
No, that's the guy who wants to live forever. Brian Adams. He would frequent random parks in cities in hopes of meeting people, women in particular. At this point, Milgaard had grown into a very handsome young man. His friend said that many hippie women in these parks would just approach him for sex. Okay? Such was the cut and thrust of the free love movement, throwing caution and monogamy to the winds and revolutionizing the world, one bone sesh at a time. Within a few months, Milgaard got a steady girlfriend, also 15, named Sharon Williams. They hitchhiked from one end of Canada to the other. This was an age of the hitchhiker, where the roads at the edge of any given town were often lined with scraggly youths with their thumbs stuck out. Milgaard and Williams occasionally got into trouble with the law, but due to their age and the fact that they were from out of town, it usually resulted in the cops just calling their parents, releasing them and putting them on a bus back home, from which Milgaard and Williams quickly absconded. In the spring of 1968, the young couple were in Ottawa, where Sharon Williams got a job in a boutique, and David Milgaard sold copies of a hippie newspaper called the Canadian Free Press at the Spark Street Mall. Aren't these guys like 15? What's happening? Where are your parents? At night, they shared a basement flat with some other carefree young people that they'd befriended in the city. Milgaard's relationship with Williams didn't last long in Ottawa because the teenager's eye was constantly drawn to other women. He gained the nickname Hoppy because he was always hopping from girl to girl. Shortly after Milgaard and Williams broke up, he returned to Langenberg to visit his parents before hitchhiking to Regina. There, Milgaard worked odd jobs, dealt drugs, and committed the occasional petty theft. After Milgaard gathered enough money in Regina, he went back to the highway and stuck out his thumb, heading off across Canada again for weeks. Whenever Milgaard ran out of money, he would return to Regina and repeat the cycle. And this is how the now 16-year-old Milgaard spent the summer and autumn of 1968. In January 69, Milgaard returned to Regina and rented a cheap room at the Kitchener Hotel. When eating at Smitty's Pancake House, Milgaard bumped into a 17-year-old that had befriended several months earlier, a high school dropout named Ron Wilson. Oh, this was Ron Wilson from earlier, right? They got to chatting, and Wilson told Milgaard about the car his parents had bought him for Christmas, a 1958 green Pontiac. Wilson said he was eager to drive it, but he didn't have enough money to get license plates, and his parents refused to pay for them. Milgaard offered to pay for the license plates and proposed that they go on a road trip, driving the green Pontiac Pontiac on an epic journey across Western Canada, through the Rocky Mountains, and all the way to the beautiful coastlines of British Columbia. Honestly, sounds kind of awesome. I'll be like, hell yeah, brother, let's go. They decided to ask a girl they knew, 16-year-old Nicole John, to go with them. She was another high school dropout who worked as a waitress at Champ's Cafe in Regina. For the past few months, Nicole and Milgaard had formed what we'd call today a friends with benefits relationship, sleeping together whenever Milgaard was in town, although Nicole felt that sometimes Milgaard was too forceful in his sexual advances. On January the 30th, 1969, Milgaard and Wilson convinced Nicole to quit her job at the cafe, cash her last paycheck, and join them on the road. The 58 Pontiac was in rough shape. All the tires were flat and the battery was out of juice. So the trio put the tires and the battery on a toboggan and dragged them to a nearby gas station. They patched the tires and filled them with air, but discovered that the car battery was as dead as a doornail and wouldn't recharge, so they broke into a garage in the suburbs and stole the battery from a car. In the process of pulling it out, Milgaard cracked the casing with a screwdriver and acid squirted onto his clothes. Eesh. They sealed the crack shut and installed the battery in the Pontiac. Bro, if you cracked your car battery, it's free, dude. You're stealing it. Just go steal one that's not cracked. What the fuck? It still wouldn't start. Yeah, dude, probably because it's cracked. So they pushed the car to the gas station, where the attendants warmed up the engine so it would run. David Milgaard, Ron Wilson, and Nicole John departed Regina at 12:30 a.m. January 31st, 1969. The plan was to drive north to Saskatoon and see if another one of Milgaard's friends, Shorty Cadrain, wanted to join them on the road trip. On the way up, Wilson and Milgaard broke into a grain elevator in the countryside, hoping to find something of value that they could sell for some money, but they only came away with a flashlight. It's like, yes, where shall we break into to steal something of value? Yes, a grain elevator. Yes, famous for all the valuable items inside. Later that night, they passed through the farming village of Craik, and the car got stuck in a ditch. Ron Wilson threw the car into reverse and accelerated too quickly, stripping the reverse gear of its transmission, making it pretty much impossible to back the car up from that point without a flurry of slipping and grinding. Eventually, after what seemed like an eternity, digging mud and snow out from tires and the minus 40-degree temperatures, the ground's going to be frozen solid. That's going to be a nightmare. And shoving with all their strength, the trio managed to get the car out of the ditch and continue on their way to Saskatoon. I don't know, if I was in Canada, in Winnipeg or whatever, and they're like, where should we take a trip for? Let's go west or east. I'll be like, no, let's go south. The further south we go, the warmer it gets. Milgaard, Wilson, and John arrived on the outskirts of the city at around 6 a.m. None of them knew where they were going. All Milgaard knew was that Shorty Cadrain lived in a neighborhood he misremembered as Peace Hill. Oh, right, it's like, where's Peace Hill? There's Pleasant Hill. They spent the better part of an hour driving all over the city, with the time of day being too early and the weather too cold to find a passerby for directions. Eventually, at around 7 a.m., the trio wound up on 21st Street, where they stopped and asked a woman walking on the sidewalk if she knew where the house of Shorty Cadrain was in Peace Hill. What the fuck is this question? Gail Miller shook her head, no, kept walking, and turned down a T-shaped alleyway. I fixed her. On March the 2nd, police tendrils extended to locate David Milgaard, Ron Wilson, and Nicole John as persons of interest in the murder of Gail Miller on January 31st. It turned out that Ron Wilson wasn't difficult to find. On March the 3rd, the day after the call went out, Saskatoon police got word that Wilson was sitting in provincial jail in Regina. Turned out that after the teens came back to Regina from their little jaunt in Alberta on February the 5th, the engine of Wilson's Pontiac had gone kaput. With no car, God, he ruined that car real quick, didn't he? It was only 10 years old, dude. Your parents just bought you like this nice green Pontiac, and you immediately ruin it. With no car, no money, Wilson parted ways with Milgaard, John, and Cadrain in order to pick up the pieces of his plans and get the car running again. Wilson carried out some burglaries and petty thefts in order to finance the repairs. On February the 25th, he was arrested in one such attempt, charged with theft in the value of over $50, and packed off to provincial jail in Regina. And there he languished until Shorty Cadrain decided to implicate them all in Gail Miller's murder. Royal Canadian Mounted Police Inspector Riddle was dispatched to talk to Wilson. I like to imagine that he was dispatched on horseback. Because they're always like mounted police. Like, are they all mounted? They can't all be mounted. The 17-year-old denied any involvement in the murder of Gail Miller and said that David Milgaard had never left his company the whole time they were in Saskatoon. On March the 11th, Riddle located Nicole John, who had gone into a hippie doss house in Regina, now that all hopes of a journey to the west coast had been dashed to the ground. She also denied any involvement in the murder of Gail Miller and denied that David Milgaard was the killer. As for David Milgaard himself, he proved a little harder to track down. After the gaggle of teens had returned to Regina on February the 5th, Milgaard had apparently bided his time in the city until the 10th, when he procured a license to sell subscriptions to Maclean's magazine. Milgaard promptly headed to Winnipeg, Manitoba, where he checked into a motel and started to make a steady wage, pounding the pavement hawking Maclean's. The RCMP got in touch with Milgaard's Winnipeg sales manager, Roger Renaud, who guided the officers to Milgaard's motel. Renaud knocked on the door and told Milgaard that the police would like to speak with him. Milgaard was taken down to the Winnipeg Boys Detention Center for interrogation. The officers present were Eddie Cast of Saskatoon Police, Staff Sergeant Edmondson of the RCMP, and Constable Kopang of the RCMP Winnipeg Detachment. Milgaard was subjected to a 6-hour interview and a physical examination for signs of scratching or bruising. Milgaard denied any involvement in the murder of Gail Miller. He said that they had gotten a map of Saskatoon a little after 7 a.m. on January 31st, then their car had gotten stuck in the snow, and after a tow truck pulled them out, they finally located Shorty Cadrain's house in Pleasant Hill. They invited Cadrain to join them on the condition that he pony up some money to repair the car's reverse transmission, and then spent a few hours driving around Saskatoon trying to locate Cadrain's girlfriend and best friend so that they'd come with them on the road trip. After failing to locate either person, the 4 teens left Saskatoon city limits at around 4:30 p.m. As for the physical exam, Cast found nothing, but then again, over a month had passed, and any wounds Gail Miller might have inflicted on Milgaard during her attack and murder could have healed. After the 6-hour interview, the officers conducted a search in Milgaard's motel room. The search turned up nothing. Milgaard was released and free to keep selling magazine subscriptions to household, hair salons, and dental offices in Winnipeg. Fascinating detail. The investigation stalled again. Police had no physical evidence tying Milgaard or his companions to the murder. All they had was the word of 17-year-old Shorty Cadrain, who might well be spinning them a line of bullshit in the vague and futile hope of collecting the $2,000 award. Yeah, even if it's bullshit. And he's just like, yeah, no, maybe I'll just tell them it's this dude, and maybe he'll go away forever so I can get $2,000. Like, maybe he just confesses because the police lean on him or something. It was unlikely Cadrain had committed the murder himself, since his parents, siblings, and neighbors all vouched that he was at home. It would be difficult to prove otherwise. On April the 4th, an 8-year-old named Giles Beauchamp visited one of Shorty Cadrain's younger siblings at their house in Pleasant Hill. Then, Beauchamp walked home. He was 3 doors down when he kicked a snowbank and shook loose an object. It was a wallet containing Gail Miller's ID. Police conducted a search of the area around Cadrain's house. They found Gail Miller's hospital insurance card in the same snowbank 3 doors down. They found a blue blood-stained 2K in the backyard of a house right next door to Cadrain's. This was all strong evidence that Cadrain had been telling the truth. The police had known since early February that the killer had disposed of some of Gail Miller's possessions on 20th Street as he drove away from the scene. And now, here was more evidence tossed near Shorty Cadrain's house in Pleasant Hill, a house that David Milgaard and his friends would visit 2 hours after the murder at 9 a.m., with Cadrain claiming Milgaard was covered in blood and eager to get out of town. Now that's looking pretty fucking suspicious, isn't it? Investigators decided to have another crack at Ron Wilson and Nickel John. For several weeks, they continued to deny having anything to do with the murder. Then, in the 3rd week of May, investigators asked Wilson and John if they'd be willing to travel from Regina to Saskatoon to retrace their steps on January 31st between midnight and 4:30 p.m. Both Ron Wilson and Nickel John consented, and they were taken in separate cars so as to not cross-contaminate their testimony. If you're guilty of something, you immediately be like, hello, mate. Quick phone call, yeah? The 2 teens, at separate intervals, showed police the grain elevator where Wilson and Milgaard had stolen a flashlight and the ditch near Craig where they'd gotten stuck. They then spent 2 days in Saskatoon, staying at the upmarket Cavalier Hotel at police expense. Nice. Wilson and John walked the T-shaped alleyway and surrounding blocks. They walked the neighborhood near Shorty Cadrain's house. They went over their movements that day, from when they drove into town at 6 a.m. to when they departed at 4:30 p.m. It was then that both Ron Wilson and Nickel John changed their story. The first thing to come out was that Ron Wilson said David Milgaard had a paring knife on him with the handle the same color as the one found in Pleasant Hill. Wilson said that after entering the city, they drove aimlessly around Saskatoon for about an hour, looking for Shorty Cadrain's house in a place called Peace Hill. Then, sometime between 6:30 and 7 a.m., they spotted a woman matching the description of Gail Miller walking down the street. David Milgaard popped his head out the car window and asked if she knew the place they were looking for. Gail Miller shook her head, no, and kept walking. She turned down an alleyway. Milgaard rolled up the window and said, "What a bitch." What the fuck? Teenagers, man. It's like, she just said, "No, I don't know where he is. Oh, no, if I go to work, you're just shouting at me, where's Shorty?" What a bitch. Ron Wilson still denied being present at the murder of Gail Miller. He claimed that after asking Miller for directions, the trio split up and Wilson exited the vehicle to go and seek further help. When the three teenagers reunited in the Pontiac, Wilson said that Milgaard was breathing heavily, covered in blood, and uttered the words, "I fixed her, brah." Wilson said that a few days later, when they were in Alberta, they found a woman's cosmetics case inside the glove compartment. Milgaard snatched it and tossed it out of the window without another word. While they were in Calgary, where today's writer was born and raised, I forget that David's Canadian. Yes! Oh, yes! Calgary! Alberta? Wilson had a conversation with Milgaard in which the latter said he quote-unquote hit a girl while they were in Saskatoon and put her purse in a trash can. Wilson did not pursue the subject. As for Nickel John, she echoed much of this story before taking it a step further. When asked if she was Milgaard's girlfriend, she was quick to deny it and added that she was afraid of him. Nickel claimed that they entered Saskatoon, drove around, and stopped to talk to Gail Miller. Milgaard said she was a bitch. They pulled into the T-shaped alleyway. Ron Wilson departed to look for help. Milgaard got out of the car, and then Nickel John sat in the vehicle and watched in horror as David Milgaard grabbed Gail Miller in the alleyway and, after a struggle, stabbed her repeatedly. Then Nickel fled from the car and ran down the street. She did not remember how or when she got back into the Pontiac, but at that point, Wilson had returned, and they set off again. A little further down the road, Milgaard threw Gail Miller's purse into a trash can, and in Alberta, he threw a women's cosmetics case out the car window. David is in big trouble. David Milgaard, that is, not David, the writer of today's episode. Just to make that clear, David had nothing to do with this. On May the 29th, 1969, Saskatoon police issued a warrant for David Milgaard's arrest. Yellow snow. After David Milgaard's 6-hour interview, physical exam, and motel room search in Winnipeg, Manitoba, he moved 2,000 kilometers or 1,240 miles west to Prince George, British Columbia, a small town of 48,000 in the middle of the Rocky Mountain Trench. Didn't they tell him not to leave town? Bros moved 2,000 kilometers away. There, he began selling magazine subscriptions again. The RCMP traced him down pretty easily, and earlier in May, before a warrant was issued for his arrest, Prince George officers swung by his motel, collecting saliva and blood samples and asking a few follow-up questions. The officers were careful to conceal the extent to which they suspected Milgaard of murder. But if he did the murder, he's going to know that you suspect him of that. Although he has been committing a bunch of other crimes, right? But then if they're going to travel 2,000 kilometers, it's not because you stole a flashlight. Then on May the 30th, 1969, Milgaard had just finished selling subscriptions door to door when he reported to his supervisor, who told him the police wanted to see him. Milgaard went down to the police station, expecting some more follow-up questions, and was promptly arrested. The next morning, May 31st, Milgaard was transferred back to Saskatoon, and he was formally charged with murder while locked up in Saskatoon City Jail on June the 2nd. Because neither Milgaard nor his family had any money, he applied for legal aid and was assigned Queen's Counsel Calvin Tallis as his lawyer. Milgaard's parents naturally protested their son's innocence, and Joyce Milgaard moved from Langenberg to Saskatoon, getting a job at a cafe in order to pay rent. She visited Milgaard whenever she could, bringing him milkshakes and comic books. Milgaard spent his 17th birthday behind bars. The preliminary hearing for the trial of David Milgaard was held on the 18th of August 1969. It lasted 3 weeks. The Crown called 42 witnesses from Cadrain, Wilson and John to police officers and experts, and even Mary Alice Marcoux, the little girl who discovered Gail Miller's body. Oh no, why? Why make her relive that? What the fuck? What's she gonna add? The trial itself began 5 months later, on January the 19th, 1970. Milgaard pleaded not guilty. He did not take the stand in his own defense. Fairly standard stuff there. It's not usually a good idea to take the stand in your own defense because it opens you up to the prosecution, and they're going to be quite aggressive. Ron Wilson was called by the prosecution and affirmed everything he had told police in May the previous year. On cross-examination, defense lawyer Calvin Tallis tried to drive home the idea that Milgaard didn't have enough time to commit the murder between Wilson's departure from the car and his return. At the preliminary hearing, Wilson had claimed to have been gone for about 5 minutes. At the trial, Wilson corrected himself to say that he'd been gone close to 15, having walked 5 or 6 city blocks before turning back. I get the feeling there's more to this story because listen to this. That's the rest of today's script. I get the feeling, if this was just, is this the rest? Is there not another script tucked in here? And it's also a David script, so you know it's going to be long. I get the feeling there's more to this story than old Milgaard here. Otherwise it will end in like 2 pages. He's guilty and went to prison forever. Nickel-John was then called by the prosecution. Her testimony remained the same up to the point that Ron Wilson left, but instead of saying she saw Milgaard stab Gail Miller to death, she now said she couldn't remember what had happened. The Crown applied to the judge to treat the witness as hostile, and this was approved. As a result, the prosecutor read to the jury Nickel-John's statement from May 1969 that said she had seen Milgaard stab Miller. As the prosecutor read out the statement, he would frequently turn to Nickel-John to ask if those details were correct. In response, Nickel-John burst into tears and repeatedly made statements like, "I don't know," or "I don't remember." Eventually, the judge ordered her to have a glass of water and stop crying. Shorty Cadrain took the stand and affirmed what he had told police back in March 1969. Under cross-examination, defense attorney Calvin Tallis tried to make hay of the fact that Cadrain had originally denied any connection to the murder when he was first interviewed by police in early February. But to no avail, Cadrain had been scared. The witness testimony, as damning as it was, nevertheless was circumstantial. Then the various belongings of Gail Miller found on the route to Shorty Cadrain's house were presented to the jury, but these were circumstantial as well. There was no direct physical evidence that it was David Milgaard who tossed them there. Right, but this section of the show, the title of this chapter was Yellow Snow. So I guess we're going to be coming back to that yellow snow that was found earlier, that the very fastidious cop bagged and froze. Gonna get the feeling that was a good shout. And so, for direct physical evidence, the Crown prosecutor raised the question of 2 lumps of yellow snow. They were found where Gail Miller had lain in the T-shaped alleyway by Lieutenant Bentala 4 days after her murder. They were duly sent to the lab. The Crown called RCMP Staff Sergeant Bruce Paintner, who spent several hours telling the jury about the tests to which the lumps of yellow snow were subjected. The lab identified human semen. They were also able to determine a blood type, A. David Milgaard had type A blood. Gail Miller had blood type O. I get the feeling that it might, even if it is his piss, he could be like, yeah, no, I took a pee in the alley, like a day later, or whatever. And I was like, why is there semen in there? It's like, oh, I don't know. Because I was, boning up with my Friends with Benefits girl before. Feels, again, circumstantial. On the 7th day of the trial, the jury was sent away and the Crown applied to introduce new evidence to the court. The defense had been briefed on this a few days before. It was now down to the judge if it could be used. On January the 18th, 1970, the day before the trial began, 2 friends of Milgaard's, Alfred Melnick and Craig Lapchuk, had approached the police. They claimed that in May 1969, they were watching a news report on the Gail Miller murder in a motel room when Milgaard reenacted the killing, stabbing a pillow repeatedly. At the time, Melnick and Lapchuk interpreted this as a dark joke, but now that Milgaard was on trial for that murder, they suspected it was an indirect admission of guilt. The judge ruled the testimony was admissible, and Melnick and Lapchuk took the stand to tell their story to the jury. Under cross-examination, Calvin Tallis pointed out that Melnick had said Milgaard reenacted the murder on the bed, whereas Lapchuk and Milgaard got off the bed to do so. Tallis also pointed out that both young men had a history of marijuana and LSD use, and that both were currently out on bail for committing crimes. Melnick for armed robbery, Lapchuk for forging checks. Whereas the question of whether or not the reenactment happened on the bed was a trifling matter, the character assassination of Melnick and Lapchuk did not seem to have any visible effect on the jury. On January the 29th, 1970, the prosecution and defense gave their closing statements. The following day, January 30th, the jury received some final instructions from the judge before going into their deliberations at 12:17 p.m. They deliberated for nearly 13 hours until 1 a.m., resuming the next day at 10 o'clock and deliberating for 1 more hour, and then they had a verdict. At 12:15 p.m., on January the 31st, 1970, a year to the day after the murder of Gail Miller, the foreman read out the jury's unanimous verdict. Guilty. There was just one problem. David Milgaard was innocent. Yes, David, I know, because look how much of it is left of this script, David. Yes. Disgrace. After 8-year-old Giles Beauchamp discovered Gail Miller's wallet in a snowbank near Shorty Cadrain's house on April the 4th, 1969, police became convinced that David Milgaard was a murderer. Then they got tunnel vision. In a routine murder investigation, the likely perpetrator is almost immediately known to the police, and then the cops compile as much evidence as they can in one direction to secure a conviction. It is highly unusual for homicide detectives to embark on a Sherlock Holmesian mission, sniffing out the tiniest clues and crafting the most outlandish of theories. Shorty Cadrain had dangled an accusation in front of the cops when they were at a dead end, and under significant public pressure to find the culprit. Beauchamp's discovery all but clinched it for them. Milgaard was a killer. It didn't help that Milgaard was a hippie, a delinquent with a checkered past for a mere 16-year-old, and a known drinker and drug user. Despite his young age, it seemed like a good fit. Police didn't look in any other direction from that point forward, and as a result, they ruined an innocent man's life, while the real culprit, a rapist and a killer, still walked the streets. Investigators immediately began to apply pressure on 17-year-old Ron Wilson and 16-year-old Milgaard in April 1969. Wilson was interrogated by police for hours, no less than 7 times in a single month. While he sat in a Regina jail for theft, the cops threatened to charge Wilson himself with Gail Miller's murder. After all, he had been there and had no alibi. When Wilson was released on the 9th, he thought that would be the end of it. The interrogations would either immediately stop or gradually die down. But that was just the start. He kept getting pulled in for questioning. Wilson began drinking daily and taking LSD twice a week. Holy shit, dude. I've never done LSD, but it sounds like a pretty wild ride, and it sounds pretty wild to be doing that shit twice a week. He also dabbled in marijuana, hashish, mescaline, and heroin. Oh my god, dude, you are on an adventure. Meanwhile, investigators located Milgaard in a hippie DOS house back in April, where she had also been into pot and LSD. In fact, from her return to Regina in February 1969 until October of that year, John was taking LSD approximately every 3 days. Does that? I feel like doing that, your brain's gonna get, like, permanently cooked, right? Can that happen on LSD?
Eat some more pills, pillhead.
I know it's like some things, like, I don't know, like if you're an adult and you have a little drinky every day, it's not gonna, like, ruin your brain. Or if you smoke a little pot every day, it's not gonna ruin your brain. Even heroin, I don't think, ruins your brain. But LSD is like, I don't know, isn't that like making your brain fire all those things at once? Not that I recommend, like, doing heroin or drinking every day, but, you know. LSD, dude? The cops took her to a Regina jail for questioning. It lasted hours. After the cops were done, they let Nichols sit in a waiting room in which they planted Shorty Cadrain, who had been instructed to tell his version of events implicating Milgaard. A drug-addled Nichols began to waver, doubt her own grasp on reality. Then she was taken in for a second round of interrogation, where Nichols reluctantly corroborated Shorty Cadrain's story, but only verbally. She refused to submit to a written statement. Then, in late May, the cops dragged both Ron Wilson and Milgaard in separate vehicles to Saskatoon to retrace their steps. Or so the cops told them. In reality, they were subjected to a grotesque pantomime designed to intimidate them. They were each shown the murder site. They were then shown Gail Miller's blood-stained clothes. Sure, the 2 teenagers initially got to stay at the upmarket Cavalier Hotel, but their cushy suites became hellish prisons. The teenagers were interrogated for hours at the Cavalier well into the first night. Then the cops put Wilson and John in the same room and interrogated them together, fueling their paranoia. Nothing the cops had done so far was in direct violation of police protocol per se, as it stood in 1969, but even back then, what they were doing was against about a dozen guidelines and best practices. Wilson cracked first. He gave a written statement falsely implicating Milgaard. He got to spend the rest of the first night and the second at the Cavalier. Milgaard resisted for longer, still refusing to give a written statement, and so, after the joint interrogation, investigators took her from the Cavalier to a women's cell block at a Saskatoon police station to spend the night. This is really not good policing, guys. You're just gonna get innocent people to commit to crimes and implicate other people. This is just a nightmare. The police did not make it clear whether or not she was under arrest. She wasn't. Milgaard panicked and started screaming and pounding on the walls. A female warden gave her some aspirin and tried to calm her down, but it was no use. Nicole was zonked out from nearly 4 months of regular LSD use, and she spent a sleepless night in the warden's room next to the cells. Even in 1969, this was clearly witness intimidation, and had the details have been known at trial, it likely would have gotten anything Milgaard told them thrown out of court. The next day, John was driven around Saskatoon again, all while being badgered by the police. They threatened her with arrest for the murder of Gail Miller. She could go down with Milgaard, for all they cared. That night, they took her back to the warden's room next to the cell block. She sat there, wide awake, for hours, waiting, with no idea what was going to happen to her. Then the investigators came back. They said they wanted a written statement from her. After that, they would drive her home to Regina. It was at this point that Milgaard resolved to give them what they wanted. More than what they wanted. In direct contradiction of what she had verbally affirmed thus far, Milgaard began to claim that she saw David Milgaard commit the murder. She submitted a rambling 10-page statement to that effect. Yeah, and the problem is, that's why now you could probably understand why she was in court later saying, I don't know. Because now she's under oath. Like, I imagine, at first she was being interrogated, so she gave that statement, but then she's in court and she's under oath, and she's like, uh-oh. She's probably had time to clear things in her head. She's probably spoken to a lawyer, blah, blah, blah. Like, things have changed. And she can't take it back directly, or she's just a confused kid. Jesus. And her brain's probably, like, super addled. Oh, my. 2 days later, the police issued a warrant for David Milgaard's arrest. When David Milgaard was arrested at Prince George Police Station on May the 30th, he initially thought it was in his best interest to cooperate with the police. Of course, because the police are like, no, you tell us. It's fine, mate. You don't need to worry. You don't need a lawyer. What do you need a lawyer for? We don't suspect you. Now tell us about the murder. Always, ladies and gentlemen, get a lawyer. Quoting him, I was just a green kid inside a lockdown situation, and I was just sitting there, and I had maps out. I'm arrested, and I'm showing them the way we came into the city, all the routes. They must have loved me. David Milgaard did not have a lawyer present. What? He didn't, did he? Yeah, because the lawyer would be, shut the f*** up, David. You don't speak unless I speak to you, David. But just to be clear, this isn't David's fault. Surely he was told he could have a lawyer. Don't they have to say you have a right to an attorney? Something like that, did the Miranda response warning? You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney, stuff like that. Milgaard was transported back to Saskatoon, where his mother... Oh, wait, this is Canada, isn't it? So it's not going to be the Miranda warning. But they must have something similarly Canadian, right? Maybe a little bit more friendly. I'm watching that TV show, Fargo. And the second season, it's set in, like, Milwaukee or somewhere like that. And everyone has the most bizarre accent. They sound kind of like Canadian, but like extremely Canadian, like parody of Canadian accents. And I'm like, is that how people sound in Milwaukee? What's up with Milwaukee? Wait, is it Minnesota? Maybe it's, Minnesota, Milwaukee? No, that doesn't sound right. Is Milwaukee a state? I don't even know. Back in Saskatoon, his mother, Joyce, visited him in prison while he awaited trial. She said, quote, I remember him wanting comic books. He was 17 by that time, but he was still such a boy. I remember sometimes we prayed together because he was a scared kid at that time, but I can remember believing in him. At the preliminary hearing in August 1969, Shorty Cadrain took the stand, gave his account of seeing Milgaard with blood on his clothes and his being eager to get out of town. Along with Milgaard disposing of a woman's cosmetic case, his creepy comments about being in the mafia and wanting to rub out Wilson and John for knowing too much. But then Cadrain went further. He claims that not only did he see blood on Milgaard's clothes, but that Milgaard told him it was blood and that they needed to get out of town. Then Cadrain told a bizarre story of how, while driving in Alberta, Milgaard signaled a truck driver by flashing his lights on and off. The driver slowed down and pulled over. Milgaard got out and handed the truck driver a suitcase. Cadrain claimed that Wilson and John were conveniently asleep in the backseat when this happened. What is going on? Why would you make this up? Is this just because he wants the $2,000 or whatever it was? You fucking psycho, you piece of... You're not only selling out your friend for $2,000, which, I mean, if they murdered someone, it's up to you. I probably would be like, I don't know. It's really hard to sell out your friend. Oh, that's a difficult situation, isn't it? But what I'm not going to do is do it for $2,000. I'd do it because it's the right thing to do. And if you're making it all up, then you're just a terrible person. All the aforementioned claims were very outlandish sounding, and Cadrain did not repeat them at trial. Instead, he reverted back to his previous story and left it at that. It's a difference when you're under oath, and they're like, well, if you lie, you're committing a crime. Meanwhile, Cadrain had received the $2,000 reward for information leading to an arrest in the murder of Gail Miller. What a douchebag. At the trial in January 1970, Shorty Cadrain and Ron Wilson. Whenever I hear Ron Wilson, I keep thinking of that Harry Potter guy. His name is Ron Weasley. Ron Weasley, not Wilson.
Mental, that one. I'm telling you.
Fulfilled their roles for the prosecution damn near flawlessly. Nickel John was another matter. She had been off the LSD for the past 2.5 months, but she was by no means psychologically stable. She's doing LSD like twice a week. I feel like most people I know have done LSD. They've done it I did it once or twice, and that's it. I've never done it myself. She was also afraid of what the police might do to her. So when Nickel John took the stand and was asked about seeing the murder, she simply said she couldn't remember. When the prosecutor treated her as a hostile witness, she burst into tears. Meanwhile, Nickel John's coerced statement, claiming to have seen the murder, was read out to the jury. The judge's decision to allow this became known as the Milgaard ruling and was enforced in the Canadian judicial system for many years. Wait, so essentially you're taking something that's not said under oath and using it in court, which the whole point of court and stuff is you put people under oath and they have to tell the truth before they can lie out their ass if they want to. Then you can lie on the stand if you want to, but there's consequences for that if they catch you. Not legal advice. The testimony of all three teenagers certainly made David Milgaard look guilty, but it was all circumstantial, as was the parade of objects found at the crime scene and surrounding area. And that brings us to the lumps of yellow snow in which the forensics lab supposedly found human semen. The Crown prosecutor repeatedly emphasized to the jury that the blood type derived from the yellow snow was type A, consistent with David Milgaard's blood. What he neglected to mention was that type A was also consistent with thousands of other men living in Saskatoon at the time. I'm super curious because I feel like it's lots, right? Type A sounds like it's like type A, type B, and then there's the unusual ones, right? Yo, ChatGPT, my dude. What percentage of people in Canada have type A blood? 36%. 36%. 1 in every 3. More than. It's not exactly DNA, is it? Like 1 in a billion or whatever. But it went further. We now know that the yellow snow wasn't human semen, it was urine, most likely dog urine. Human semen would not form a yellow stain if a man ejaculated into a snowbank at minus 40 degrees. Wait, I was assuming that there was like traces of the semen in the pee. Like it had a slash after having sex or something. Wait, it just wasn't, it was just dog pee? You wouldn't be able to see it after it froze, except under ultraviolet light. Don't take ultraviolet lights to a hotel. Meanwhile, male dog urine often contains semen because of anatomical differences and a greater likelihood of retrograde ejaculation, which mixes the semen with urine in the bladder. Ugh, gross. Also, an unneutered dog will have frequent bouts of being in heat and will often have some leftover semen in his urethra. Yeah, that's what I thought it was. Like just leftover semen in the urethra. As for how Saskatoon Forensics Lab could have mistaken dog blood type for human blood type, which they should have been screening for given the origins of the sample, 1960s serological tests were certainly not as advanced as they are today, nor was scientific knowledge of canine blood types as well developed. But even then, it would have taken a certain degree of incompetence to mistake one thing for the other. Yeah, dude, if your job is analyzing urine and you can't tell the difference between human semen and dog urine, what are you doing? And perhaps the lab technician simply saw what they wanted to see. That brand of tunnel vision seems to have been the case with much of this investigation. Indeed. And that brings us to the late inclusion of the testimonies of Alfred Melnick and Craig Lapchuk, in which they claimed David Milgaard reenacted the murder of Gail Miller after watching a story about her on the news. Not only were Melnick and Lapchuk criminal types with long rap sheets, out on bail for armed robbery and forgery respectively, they were known as informants for the police. They were paid $500 a head for snitching on local drug dealers. That's a lot of money isn't that like $5,000? Although the idea, snitch on your local drug dealer for money, so at some point you're going to get killed. The implication here would be that in order to clinch a conviction, Melnick and Lapchuk were bribed by the police to testify, allegedly. 2 other people were present in the motel room where Milgaard allegedly reenacted the murder. One of them, Ute Frank, was another of Milgaard's friends with benefits, who was too zonked out of her head on drugs to remember anything either the prosecution or defense could use. The other witness was Deborah Hall, a Regina hairdresser, who had merely smoked some weed that night and was relatively lucid. It's like, she's the one who's not a druggie, and she's still high. This guy's teenage life is wild. She would later claim that Melnick and Lapchuk's version of events was a complete and utter lie. A story on Gail Miller had come up on the news. Milgaard had cracked a joke, but he did not grab a knife and reenact the murder using a pillow. Hall was quite emphatic on that point. But at the time of the trial, she was not interviewed by either the prosecution or the defense, despite being known to both sides, and was not called to testify. When the verdict of guilty was handed down on January the 31st, 1970, exactly a year after Gail Miller's death, David Milgaard was stunned. Quote, "I don't remember actually hearing them say guilty or not guilty. I just heard a bunch of noises behind me and kind of turned around. I looked at my dad. I never really saw my dad look anything but what he was. Strong. At that point, I looked. He didn't look very strong. It scared me. And then I realized they must have said guilty." A few moments later, David Milgaard was sentenced to life in prison. He was 17 years old. How's this work in Canada? Are we talking life without parole here? He's also 17. Is that not some mitigating factor there? And he committed the crime allegedly when he was 16? right? I'm sorry, he didn't commit the crime. He was accused of committing the crime when he was 16, I think. Sorry, there was one day that passed. I did like half this episode yesterday and half of it ran out of time. I apologize. You'll probably tell I'm wearing a different shirt if you're watching this on YouTube. At least he's not getting the death penalty because it's Canada. Joyce Milgaard wept in the car on the 4-hour drive back home to Langenberg. In the coming months, the social stigma against the Milgaards in the tiny farming community became so strong that they had no choice but to move away. They headed back to Winnipeg. As for the Milgaard family's belief in David's innocence, it never really wavered. Joyce said, "When we first heard about the murder, I had to know if there were any drugs or alcohol involved. I'm a realist to the extent that if drugs and alcohol are involved, anything can happen." Holy shit, dude. I don't know how many drugs and alcohol I'd have to be on to murder someone. I don't think... I don't know, I've been pretty f***ed up in my life, but it's never murdered anybody. I don't think I've ever committed any crimes while drunk. Just trying to think if I vandalized shit as a kid when I was drunk. I mean, maybe, probably. David Milgaard began his life sentence, while his lawyer, Calvin Tallis, appealed the verdict on the grounds that the judge should not have been allowed the reading of Nickeljohn's statement to the jury. Yeah, definitely shouldn't have. Almost a year passed. Then on January the 5th, 1971, the Saskatchewan Court of Appeals upheld the verdict. Calvin Tallis escalated the appeal to the Canadian Supreme Court, but they wouldn't hear it. With all his options exhausted, David Milgaard had no choice but to serve a life sentence for a crime he didn't commit. Blackstone's Nightmare. Between his conviction on January 31st, 1970 and the rejection of his appeal on January 5th, 1971, David Milgaard spent his first year in prison reasonably confident that his appeal would be successful after all. He was innocent. As a young man, he was somewhat naive and had little inkling of the frailty of the modern judicial system or how often, in fact, justice does not prevail. Yeah, I have to say, before starting this podcast, I'd say I fell into that category of being fairly naive, and it's this stuff goes wrong all the time. Innocent people getting put in prison, guilty people just never get found. Oof. Fully expecting to be released and thoroughly incensed that he was locked up by mistake, in his first year behind bars, David Milgaard frequently rebelled against prison authority. He was charged with 31 institutional offenses, from swearing at the guards to refusing to obey orders to throwing buckets of water at prison staff to threatening a guard with a knife. He was punished with solitary confinement, and occasionally the guards beat the shit out of him. As for the other inmates, usually a rapist murderer would be tormented and possibly killed during his stay in prison. According to the convict's informal code, sex offenders are the lowest of the low, because who says that criminals can't have scruples? Oh, for sure. If you're in prison for, robbery or something, you're like, well, I needed money to feed my family. I'm not saying robbery's right, but if someone's like, oh no, I just raped people, and it's like, well, you're just a piece of shit then, aren't you? I think it's completely fine for prison to be a tier list of crimes. Yet in the first year of Milgaard's stay, the inmates largely left him alone. The prison psychiatrist expressed astonishment in his notes at that fact, but the reality was that Milgaard had told the other inmates he was innocent, and the inmates believed him. For the first 2 years of it, really? I'd assume if you're in prison, you're like, no, I'm really actually innocent. They'll be like, yeah, you and everyone else, mate. For the first 2 years of his imprisonment, David Milgaard was kept at the Prince Albert Penitentiary in Saskatchewan. It was thus a major blow for David when his family moved back to Winnipeg, Manitoba, and were no longer able to visit so often. Shortly after his parents moved away, David's appeal was rejected, and he fell into a depression. The prison psychiatrist put him on an alternation of sedatives and stimulants, uppers and downers that played with his mind and kept him more docile for the guards. Ah, yes, right. 1970s psychiatric medication. But it also rendered him more vulnerable to bullying and assault. A few of the inmates interpreted the rejection of Milgaard's appeal as a sign of his guilt, and on multiple occasions took a swing at him in the yard. Several times in 1971, David Milgaard tried to take his own life. Once he jumped from a second-story window, another time he swallowed a dozen stripped wires, requiring emergency surgery to prevent them from ripping open his stomach. Several times, David slashed his own wrists. The idea of spending most of his natural life in prison was too much for him. Death was preferable. In the autumn of 1971, David Milgaard went on a hunger strike, demanding that he be transferred to a prison in Manitoba so that he could be closer to his parents. Prison officials rejected his demands. Meanwhile, a retinue of psychiatrists was brought in to try and figure out how to stop Milgaard from trying to take his own life. One doctor said he displayed no antisocial or violent tendencies beyond his understandable anger for being locked up while protesting his innocence. Another doctor said that he was, quote, easily led by evil forces. Another doctor diagnosed him as a stone-cold psychopath. I mean, I don't think What indicates that he's a psychopath? Even if he did the crime, it's not like it wasn't some. I just don't think he's a psychopath. At the beginning of March 1972, prison officials informed Milgaard that he was being transferred to Dorchester Penitentiary in New Brunswick, in the maritime provinces of the eastern coast of Canada, 4,000 kilometers or 2,500 miles away, leapfrogging Manitoba by some distance and widening the gulf between Milgaard and his parents rather than narrowing it. Why? Milgaard was enraged, but prison officials dangled a carrot. If he displayed impeccable behavior at Dorchester, in a year's time he'd be transferred to the Stony Mountain Institution, a prison near his parents in Winnipeg. It's funny they've got a prison called Dorchester. There's a hotel in London called the Dorchester, which is about as far away from a prison as you could imagine. It's very nice. On March the 24th, 1972, Milgaard entered Dorchester Penitentiary and started marking his calendar. Dorchester was a rough place, rife with brutality from the guards and shivving among the inmates. Milgaard kept his head down and behaved himself. It didn't prevent the occasional beating and forced sodomizing, but he completed his high school education by correspondence and enrolled at the University of New Brunswick, where he took a philosophy course. His final grade was a B. In early 1973, it became clear that the promise he would be transferred to Stony Mountain in Manitoba was a lie, so Milgaard joined a group plotting a prison break. On March 24th, 1973, a year to the day that David Milgaard had entered Dorchester Prison, Milgaard and two other inmates fooled the guards by doing the overnight head count by filling their bed with dummies that they'd constructed from linens, scrap, and trash. Rate that really works. It was just some B-movie shit. Meanwhile, Milgaard and his compatriots were hiding in the gym, waiting for their chance to scale the wall of the prison. They had a gun lifted from a guard's locker. Good lord! How sloppy can you be, prison staff? However, at midnight, a guard came through with a German Shepherd to do a routine search of the gym. When the dog drew near their hiding place, the inmates hit the dog, startling it and sending it fleeing. The inmates held the guard at gunpoint and forced him to keep sending reports over the radio so as not to arouse suspicion. The guard was subsequently bound and gagged. Then Milgaard and his two companions used a long extension cord rope to climb the prison wall, and they escaped. Wow, it's quite an effective prison break, apparently. Although all prisoners, isn't it like the stats are you break out of prison and the chances of you being put back in prison within 2 days are really high. Alarm wasn't raised in the prison until 5:30 a.m. Roadblocks were set up, search teams fanned out across the province. A helicopter roamed the skies. All New Brunswick law enforcement was notified. Milgaard and the other two inmates made it to Sackville and stole a truck, but they discovered that roadblocks prevented them from leaving the area. So they drove to a farmhouse on the edge of town and took an elderly couple, the Estabrooks, hostage. The plan was to wait till the cops took their roadblocks down. In the meantime, they ate the elderly couple's food and drank their booze. Don't get drunk during a prison escape. What are you doing? Don't even have one beer. It affects your judgment. And you've been in prison forever. Oh, I guess they do have booze in prison, right? They make their own booze. I was just going to be your tolerance is nothing. But I guess they do. They're okay. But don't drink while you're on the run. Also, what happens in a situation like this? Milgaard is innocent. We know that. David said so. And he's sent to prison for a crime that he didn't commit. And he breaks out of prison and takes people hostage and stuff. These are crimes that are going to attract major prison time on their own. So now even if he is innocent, isn't he going to go back to prison? Even if they were oh no, we found out you're innocent, but you did this other stuff, so now you're going to jail for real this time, right? The phone started ringing. The Estabrooks' children and relatives began wondering where they were. With a gun to her head, Mrs. Estabrooks gave short, polite answers telling them they were fine. But their relatives could tell something was wrong. They called the cops. Suspecting that the Estabrooks had been taken hostage by the escapees, police arrived in force at the farmhouse. Milgaard and the other two inmates made a dash for the woods. The cops did not open fire and let them go. Instead, a helicopter tracked them to the Trans-Canada Highway, where police cars surrounded them. Exposed on the road, the fugitives had no choice but to surrender or die, and they chose the former. As a result of the prison break and the hostage-taking, David Milgaard had another 6 years added to the already indefinite term of his sentence. Do you think he's sitting in prison now and he's well, at least I'm now in prison for something that I actually did, you douchebags? In 1974, the now 21-year-old David Milgaard was transferred back to Prince Albert Penitentiary in Saskatchewan. Again, prison officials promised him that with some good behavior, Milgaard would be transferred to Stony Mountain near Winnipeg. Why would he believe them? I'd get it in writing, dude. Get your lawyer to get that written down. Milgaard had no choice but to believe them and, again, behaved himself. Meanwhile, he took more university courses, getting an A in sociology. I think if I was in prison, I'd just be I'm just going to learn some shit that I'm interested in. I'd love to take a degree in philosophy. Sociology, sure. Philosophy, yeah. I'd do some physics. I know, it'd be great. Finally, some time to read. I can slow down. 2 years later, in August 1976, prison officials actually made good on their word and finally transferred Milgaard to Stony Mountain. Yay! His parents could now visit him more regularly again. 2 weeks after arriving at the Manitoba prison, Milgaard was granted a 3-hour temporary leave of absence so he could travel into Winnipeg and visit his dying grandmother. Oh, Canada, you're so nice. It was an opportunity for Milgaard to be surrounded by his family again for the first time in 6.5 years. Okay, so he spent 6.5 years in prison, right? Which is the amount that he had added onto his sentence. So I think now you'd be like, well, time served, right? If they found out he's innocent, then they'd be like, time served for the kidnapping. Hostage taking? Is there a difference? I suppose so. It did wonders for his mental health. Naturally, 2 guards were sent with him. The visit went off without a hitch, and Milgaard was awarded with another leave of absence 2 months later in October. In the summer of 1977, Milgaard applied for day parole to take classes in person at the University of Manitoba, a tall order for someone convicted of sexually aggravated murder. Also working against him was Milgaard's insistence that he was innocent, which could be interpreted as a lack of remorse. I hate that. It's such a stupid system. The parole board denied Milgaard's application. It was very tempting for Milgaard to accept responsibility for Gail Miller's murder in order to grease the wheels with the parole board, but he wouldn't do this. So he focused his efforts on accomplishing everything else within his power that would be viewed favorably by the board. He became an apprentice mechanic in the prison workshop fixing sewing machines. He avoided trouble with the guards. He completed the first year of a correspondence degree with a 3.2 GPA. I don't know what that... a 4 GPA is really good. I don't know how... because, I don't know, we didn't have GPAs. But, I think 3.2 has got to be pretty solid, right? He served on the prison's Student Advisory Committee. In 1978, Milgaard successfully applied for regular temporary absences to visit his family at their home. Each time, Milgaard would return to prison punctually and without issue. All of this looked great on a parole application. I'm very surprised they let him do this, considering that one of the reasons he's still in prison now is because he escaped from prison. In 1979, Milgaard first became eligible for full parole and released from prison, 9 years into a life sentence, and he also had the 6 years tacked on for the prison break in New Brunswick. Depending on what part of the world you're from, this may strike you as surprisingly lenient, given Milgaard was convicted of a brutal murder. This is the thing. I do think that's extreme, like 9 years and you can be considered for parole for sexually aggravated murder. Because if we didn't know he was innocent, I'd be like, are you insane? Are you insane? 9 years for aggravated rape and murder? But it was the 1970s and it was Canada. Enough said. On the other hand, the parole board was highly unlikely to release a man convicted of such a crime the first time he came up for full parole. There would be a public outcry. And looming over everything was David Milgaard's refusal to admit his guilt. On January 22, 1979, Milgaard was sent to a psychiatric center in Saskatoon for a 1-month evaluation in the run-up to his parole hearing. Dr. R.F. Rockstro concluded that Milgaard had no glaring mental illnesses. He had no violent tendencies. Rockstro also took note of the fact that Milgaard said he was willing to take a truth drug or polygraph to prove his claims of innocence. Rockstro said that Milgaard's reactions in conversation were consistent with a man who was truly innocent. However, Rockstro also diagnosed Milgaard with psychopathy, albeit a moderate, non-violent sort. Oh, okay. Surely you've got someone who's extremely emotional, and then a psychopath, like, on your scale. The two extreme ends, like, can't control their emotions, feels everything, and then feels nothing. Everyone's on the spectrum somewhere, right? Like, I'm probably somewhere in the middle. I'm not particularly like, oh my god, but I'm also definitely feel things. And most people are probably somewhere in the middle. Rockstro ended his report by saying that Milgaard was not ready to be released and needed another 2 years of rehabilitation in prison and various mental health programs to address his psychopathy. Quote, there is a possibility, though not in my view a strong one, that Mr. Milgaard is innocent of the offence of which he's been found guilty. Even if this could be demonstrated to be the case, it would still be necessary for him to receive the treatment as referred to above. Yeah, I mean, fair. He's a doctor. He's just saying he needs treatment because his brain is not right. Fair play. It's a hell of a thing when your attending psychiatrist admits the possibility you may be innocent of murder, but then says you're a psycho and it's probably for the best that you're locked up anyway. Am I saying that he just needs to be in a mental health program of some kind? I don't necessarily think that means he needs to be locked up. On June the 19th, 1979, the parole board rejected David Milgaard's application for parole. He was now 26 years old, and since his arrest in Prince George, he had not been a free man for 10 years and 19 days. Also, there's a huge difference between a 16-year-old and a 26-year-old in terms of their brain cooking. Like, I remember being 16. You can't make proper decisions as a 16-year-old. 26, though, your brain's almost done. You know, you're making better... I still think people in their 20s probably don't make the best decisions, because when's your brain finish cooking? It's like 30, right? But the difference between 16 and 26 is absolutely massive. Dubious respite. In July 1969, a bureaucratic absurdity emerged in David Milgaard's case. The parole board had recommended he get treatment at a mental hospital in order to be rehabilitated. He was duly transferred to a psychiatric center in Penetanguishene, Ontario. Thanks for the pronunciation guide there, David. It was still tricky even with it. Penetanguishene. But in order to admit Milgaard, they needed to certify him as mentally ill under the Ontario Mental Health Act. He was assessed and found sane and promptly sent back off to Stony Mountain. Milgaard's family sent a strongly worded letter of complaint to his parole officer. The condition of Milgaard getting paroled one day was getting mental health treatment, yet he was determined to not be mentally ill and refused said treatment. So, how was he to meet the parole board requirement? Instead of addressing the family's complaints, the parole officer simply declared to his superiors that he did not wish to be a scapegoat for the situation and asked to be reassigned. Dude, you're just copping out. Prison officials decided to get Milgaard assessed again. The report found that Milgaard did not have any psychopathy or any kind of personality disorder, and that he'd made great strides while in prison and would have a strong support network of family members who would help him upon release. It was the sort of glowing report that could, in fact, secure Milgaard parole. Alarmed, the Crown Prosecutor at Milgaard's trial sent the parole board several letters admonishing them not to release a vicious killer. And the former Chief of Saskatoon Police, James G. Kettles, temporarily joined the parole board in 1980, right when the question of David Milgaard again crossed their desk. That seems like a massive conflict of interest. What are you doing? It seems unlikely that this was a coincidence. You've got to recuse yourself. If you're sitting on the parole board of someone that, you know, your officers underneath you or whoever investigated and investigated, you got to be like, I can't touch this one. That was my guys, and I don't want them to be wrong. Or to, to put out someone who they put in. On August the 20th, 1980, Milgaard sat down with his caseworker to discuss the progress of his rehabilitation. The caseworker told him that he shouldn't expect to be paroled any time in the next 4 years. 2 days later, on August 22nd, Milgaard was given yet another temporary leave of absence to be with his family in Winnipeg. They cooked steaks on the barbecue and played pool. Then David's sister Maureen asked his custodian if she could have 5 minutes alone to speak to her brother. Her request was granted. Once they were alone, Milgaard and his sister promptly hopped in Maureen's car and drove away. This is a terrible idea, dude. You're going to get parole. They stopped at a drugstore and bought hair bleach so Milgaard could transform himself from a brunette into a blonde. Then Maureen drove her brother to a bus station, bought him a ticket to Toronto, gave him a wad of cash and said goodbye. Maureen then went to a payphone and called the cops. Shedding some fake tears, she claimed that David had forced her to do it and had hopped on a bus to British Columbia. Law enforcement across Manitoba went into high alert. The RCMP commenced a countrywide search, but this time, Milgaard was nowhere to be found. He's gonna get found. This is a rubbish escape plan. Then you're not gonna get parole, my dude. Come on. Why? The bus took him 2,200 kilometers or 1,370 miles from Winnipeg to Toronto. Jesus Christ, Canada's really big. That's not even like the whole way across, is it? Of course not. The idea was to disappear into a bustling city of 2.1 million people. Using the false name Dave McAdam, Milgaard used his sister's cash to rent a room at a downtown boarding house, and the next day got a low-paying job as a telemarketer, a line of work where potential customers would never see his face. Yes, fair enough. How do you get a job? Does he have a fake ID and a fake identity and stuff? I guess fake ID, fake identity, same thing. But I mean like a whole fake identity with an ID card and all this. I know it's the past, but where'd you get that from? Milgaard held the job until September 26th when he was fired for absenteeism. Thereafter, Milgaard panhandled, pumped gas, ran errands, and did yard work to pay rent at the boarding house. At the start of October, Milgaard bumped into a girl named Rhonda Hicks coming out of a record store. Milgaard stopped her and asked for directions. They got to talking. Milgaard identified himself as Dave McAdam. Rhonda gave Milgaard her number, and the next day he rang, and they began dating. I mean, this is all well and good because we know he's innocent, but if he was guilty, can you imagine? You'd be like, oh no, Rhonda, no! Rhonda Hicks was a 16-year-old high school student. All right, oh, steady. What's the age of consent in Canada? The age of consent in Canada at the time was 14. Oh, shit, Canada. But most people back then would likely agree that it was unseemly or creepy for a 28-year-old man to date a 16-year-old girl. Half your age plus 7, what is that? 14 plus 7, 21. She's 16. Yeah, you're 5 years out, dude. That's why it's creepy. Because you could be like 28, 20. Yeah, it's a little bit creepy, isn't it? But 21, you'd be like, oh, yeah, okay. Yes, okay. Somehow that seems different. Half your age plus 7. It's like a magical thing. I'm not weird. Doing anything. My wife's a year younger than me. Steady. Rhonda would take the bus downtown every day after school. Having a girlfriend when you're 28 who goes to school. What the fuck? That's so weird. They'd panhandle for an hour and then spend the money at a bar or restaurant before heading back to Milgaard's rented room. Only a few days after they started dating, Milgaard confessed to Rhonda his real name and the fact that he was a fugitive wrongly convicted of murder. That is incredibly risky. What are you doing? Rhonda kept seeing him. Their relationship lasted for several weeks. Yeah, but that relationship's going to end, and then you got to be like, Rhonda, please don't tell. Rhonda later said, in all our time together, he was never violent or abusive. In fact, just the opposite. I found him to be kind, gentle, and concerned about my welfare. He was realistic about his situation. He knew he wasn't out for good. He knew he would be caught. On November the 8th, thanks to an anonymous tip, Rhonda, the RCMP and Toronto police tracked David Milgaard down to Queen Street in the west end of the city. The anonymous tipster had claimed that Milgaard was in possession of a sawn-off shotgun and planned to rob a bank. Corporal Jack Briscoe of the RCMP chased Milgaard down an alley. Briscoe thought he saw Milgaard reaching for a gun and shot him in the ass. Holy shit. Milgaard was captured and taken to hospital. No sawn-off shotgun was ever found. This was Milgaard's second escape attempt, and this time he stayed at large for 2.5 months. That his chances of parole. Yeah, no shit. Milgaard later said, I did the wrong thing, but I was losing a little bit of myself every day in prison, and that's why I did it. Yeah, I guess I'm like, this doesn't make any logical sense. But then try being locked up in prison for like 12 years or whatever for something you didn't do, and then try and make a logical decision, right? Resistance. In November 1980, while her son recuperated in hospital, Joyce Milgaard cashed in $10,000 Registered Retirement Saving Plan, RRSP, and offered the cash as a reward for information leading to the arrest of Gail Miller's real murderer. $10,000 is roughly $37,000 in modern money. In December, the Milgaards distributed pamphlets about the reward all over Saskatoon, and the local media quickly took notice. Joyce went on TV multiple times to plead her son's case. Next, Joyce Milgaard reviewed the court transcripts, and the family staged a reenactment of the murder in the T-shaped alleyway to see if it could have possibly played out the way the Crown prosecutor had alleged. Meanwhile, the tips flooded in. All of them were bogus. In January 1981, Joyce tracked down Ron Wilson. He was hesitant to talk, but explained how the police had leaned on him. Now, Wilson said he did not think Milgaard was guilty. He regretted not coming forward in the years since, but was scared to do so, and preoccupied with drug abuse issues. Nickel John was nowhere to be found. But there were other witnesses. On the morning of January 31st, 1969, Milgaard, Wilson, and John had asked Gail Miller for directions on 21st Street mere moments before she had turned into the T-shaped alleyway and been killed. Meanwhile, Milgaard, Wilson, and John proceeded to 22nd Street, where Milgaard went into the Travelier Motel, where he asked the manager, Robert Rasmussen, directions to quote-unquote Peace Hill. Rasmussen gave the teenager a map of the city. He did not notice any blood on Milgaard's clothes. The only unusual thing Rasmussen noted about the boy was, ever the hippie, Milgaard ran into the motel from the car in his stocking feet. Rasmussen was not called to testify at trial. What's stocking feet? Wait, just in his socks? After leaving the motel, Milgaard, Wilson, and John drove down Avenue T between 12th and 21st Street and several blocks from Avenue O and the alleyway where Gail Miller had been killed. There they saw Walter Danchuk trying to free his car from a snowdrift next to the house. The teenagers volunteered to gently push the car out with their Pontiac, and as a result, both cars got stuck. According to Danchuk, the time was 7:30 a.m., roughly half an hour since Gail Miller walked down the T-shaped alleyway, meaning that Rasmussen must have seen Milgaard before then, leaving precious little time for Milgaard to carry out a murder. Indeed. Yeah, I guess that's one thing. If you're really unhappy with how the police investigated things, and you've got $37,000 to spare, do your own investigation. Just be like, cool, I'm just going to pay private detectives and ex-police officers to see what's going on. Right? I'm just going to do my own investigation. If you can't do it properly, police. Danchuk invited the three teenagers to wait inside his home while he called a tow truck. He did not see any blood on Milgaard's clothes, only a slight tear in the seat of his pants. Walter Danchuk's wife, Sandra, brought them all glasses of water. She also didn't see any blood on David Milgaard's clothes. Neither Walter nor Sandra noticed anything in Nickel-John's behavior that suggested she'd just witnessed a brutal murder. She was calm, collected, and perfectly normal. This is ridiculous. How did this not come out before? Because the police got the railroad thing, the tunnel vision. They're like, there's our guy, let's get him, boom. Not good enough, police, not good enough. The Danchuks were not called to testify at David Milgaard's trial. The teens waited with the Danchuks for over an hour, past 8:30 a.m. The tow truck arrived and quickly extracted the two vehicles. The teenagers got in their Pontiac, but now the car wouldn't start. The tow truck driver gave them a boost with his jumper cables. The driver said the bill for this assistance came to $3. The past, everybody. Still, that'd be like $30 today, right? Something like that? Even less, maybe. That ain't bad. That's really not bad at all. I remember once I got a blown out tire. And the tow truck just took me to the nearest tire place. It cost 200 euros. I was like, God damn, son. And then I found out that I had recovery assistance. It was part of my insurance and I just didn't know. I was like, oh, God damn it. Milgaard asked if he could make change for a 10. The driver said no, and Milgaard proposed they drive to a nearby gas station together and they'd get change there. But when the tow truck driver turned off Avenue T in the direction of the gas station, the teenagers sped off in the opposite direction. He was giving you such a good deal, and you're like, I don't even know what it is. Shortly after, at around 9 a.m., Milgaard, Wilson, and John found Shorty Cadrain's house in Pleasant Hill. Joyce collected the statements of Wilson, Rasmussen, and the Danchuks and secured the cooperation of a journalist for Maclean's magazine to cover the story. Ooh, that's a good one. Journalists would eat this up. It's a good story, and you've paid for all the research. The following month, February 1981, Joyce Milgaard tracked down Nickel-John in Regina. Since the trial, she'd gotten married and divorced, but kept her marriage surname Demian. Originally, Nicole refused to speak to Joyce, but then reluctantly agreed on the condition that she could have her lawyer present. She was decidedly less cooperative than Ron Wilson. Nicole said she didn't remember anything about 21st Street or Gail Miller or many interrogations by police afterward. She refused to say whether the police had leaned on her. If anything, she said they'd treated her quite well. With regard to Milgaard, Nicole added, quote, "He raped me. Well, maybe is too strong of a word. He forced me. David forces his will on people. David's a con artist. David's a manipulator. Whether you think something or not, he can make you think the other. I have a tendency of doing things that I don't want to do." I've got news for you, Nicole. If someone manipulates you into having sex with them, that isn't... Nicole. Joyce suggested that with regard to Nicole's lack of memory about that time, perhaps they should consult a doctor to remove any mental block. The case behind that, at least in British law, is interesting. It's one of the cases I remember from university where a woman accused her boss of rape or sexual assault or something because he said, "I'll give you a promotion if you have sex with me." She had sex with him, and then he's like, "Nah, changed my mind." And the courts were basically, more for you, lady. Which is an interesting precedent. I wonder if that's changed. We live in a different world these days, don't we? Nicole agreed on the condition that Joyce cover the cost as well as the expenses of Nicole's lawyer. A psychiatrist was found and they arranged for Nicole to take sodium panthenol, a barbiturate sometimes used as a truth drug. But at the last moment, Nicole pulled out and left Regina and moved to Kelowna, British Columbia, refusing to speak to Joyce any further about Gail Miller's murder. I mean, I don't approve of the ethics of her leaving, but it is her right to not be involved in this if she just wants to move on with her life, you know. Joyce moved on and spoke to Roger Renault, Millard's safe sales supervisor for Maclean subscriptions in Winnipeg. Renault said that he sometimes got Milgaard to babysit his two children, and there was no way he was a murderer. Renault offered to give Milgaard a job the day he got out of prison. Next, Joyce spoke to Alfred Melnick, one of the young men who'd claimed at trial that Milgaard reenacted the murder of Gail Miller on a pillow. Melnick admitted that he was very high on drugs at the time and confirmed that 2 weeks after the trial he had gotten an extremely light sentence of just 6 months for armed robbery, the lightest ever handed down in Saskatchewan history. Then Joyce interviewed Deborah Hall, who was also in the motel when Milgaard supposedly reenacted Gail Miller's murder. Hall said that Melnick and Lapchuk's testimonies were utter lies. Milgaard had done no such thing. Finally, with the assistance of Maclean's magazine, Joyce managed to track down Shorty Cadrain, who now had a wife and kids. But just as with Nicole, Joyce didn't find her conversation with Cadrain to be very helpful. He expressed a fear that a vengeful David Milgaard would get out of prison and murder him and his family. He said that Milgaard was possessed by the devil. Cadrain then reasserted his claims that he saw Milgaard covered in blood on January 31st, 1969, and that Milgaard was connected to the mafia. I mean, this was just crazy that he was saying as a 16-year-old. Give the guy a break. Shortly afterward, Joyce spoke to Gudrun's brother, Dennis, who said that Shorty had to be institutionalized 4 years after the trial after claiming to be the son of God and that he still had a screw loose. Dennis added that Joyce should not take anything Shorty said as gospel. No, he said he was possessed by the devil and that Shorty himself believes he was the son of God. Probably not a reliable witness. While Joyce Milgaard was doing all this sleuthing, she was employed as a secretary at a property management firm in Winnipeg. Because she would need to take so much time off, she volunteered to resign, but her boss was supportive and would hear none of it. He said she could take as much time as she needed to free her son. What a legend. That is the kind of boss that I would aspire to be, or I do aspire to be. Like, yeah, fuck yeah. Meanwhile, when the Saskatoon police heard that Joyce Milgaard was trying to prove her son's innocence, they contacted all the witnesses attached to the case and told them not to speak to her any further. Shutting that down, are we? I wonder why. Maybe you think you got it wrong, perhaps. Help came from an unforeseen quarter. When David Milgaard sold subscriptions for Maclean's magazine in '69, he had a co-worker named Howard Shannon who always liked David. Shannon approached Joyce and offered to pay the legal costs of David's exoneration. Joyce gratefully accepted and hired a Regina lawyer called Tony Merchant. The lawyer thought that there was a solid chance they could secure Milgaard's release from prison, but what they needed was a key witness to admit perjury or else find some physical evidence putting the case into doubt. That's a big ask. For someone to admit that they did a crime when they could just shut the fuck up and not mention it, or find some physical evidence over a decade and change later. 2 decades later? Decade and 69? No, 69, what was the date now? 70-something? Whatever. A long time. Oh no, it was the 80s, wasn't it? Tony Merchant's first move was to talk to David Milgaard's 1969 defense lawyer Calvin Tallis, but Tallis refused to talk to him, citing attorney-client privilege. Yeah, fair enough. Merchant replied that he was Milgaard's lawyer now, had his approval, and would apply the same attorney-client privilege to all information, but Calvin Tallis still refused to talk to him. Is that because he's still bound? Surely if Milgaard says, you can talk to him, then that's fine, and they'll share the information. Because he'd be like, no, I give you permission to break my privilege. Theories as to why Tallis refused to cooperate include him not wanting Merchant to poke holes in the quality of the defense he provided, or Tallis privately believing that his client in '69 was guilty of murder and belonged in prison, but we'll never know. Then Merchant set about trying to convince Wilson, Demian, or Cadrain to admit to giving false testimony under police coercion, but to no avail. The effort stalled. Yeah, because the problem is you can admit to that, but then when they're asking you to admit to perjury, it's really different, because that's a crime. One is just, oh, you lied to the police. Okay, you obstructed an investigation. Okay. Perjury, though, bigger deal. Meanwhile, after recovering from his gunshot wound, David Milgaard was transferred to the maximum security Millhaven Penitentiary in Bath, Ontario. The gulf had widened between him and his family again, and all of his leave of absence privileges were suspended. Unsurprisingly, his 1981 parole application was rejected. I mean, yeah, no, you escaped from prison for 2.5 months. They're not going to let you go out for a steaks and pool again, are they? In 1982, after a spell of good behavior, Milgaard managed to return to Stony Mountain Prison near Winnipeg. His privileges did not resume. His parole applications continued to be rejected. Another 4 years passed. David Milgaard turned 34. He had now spent the same amount of his life in prison as he had out of it. Yeah, but also more. Because the first few years don't count. You don't even know about them. And then you're a child, so you don't really get to make any of your own decisions and stuff. Like, almost all of his, you know, real, what's the word? Like, where you have your own choices. That part of his life has been in prison. The big guns. In August 1986, Joyce Milgaard paid a well-respected Winnipeg criminal lawyer, Hirsch Walsh, $2,000 or $6,500 in modern money to look at the information that she had collected and give his professional opinion on her son's case. But, quite frankly, Walsh was a bit of a dick about it. He took the money, promised he'd look into it himself, and then promptly handed the file to a 27-year-old junior lawyer who had just joined the firm named David Asper. Milgaard was his first ever case. It turned out to be a blessing in disguise, though. Asper painstakingly went over the file and was constantly in touch with Joyce Milgaard over the phone and in person. I have to say, though, this is how law firms work. Like, if you go to a big law firm and you're like, can you deal with this problem for me? Most of the work's just going to be done by some grunt. Like, that's just how it works. And it's probably cheaper because he's billing out at a lower rate than Walsh would bill out, so your $6,500 will get you further. It wasn't long before Asper stopped billing her for his time. An innocent man was in jail, and the mother wanted her son back. Asper's boss is going to be like, dude, billable hours, my dude. Bill. Asper visited Milgaard in prison to get his version of events firsthand. He then travelled to Saskatoon to retrace the movements of Milgaard, Wilson, and John that morning. He measured distances and calculated driving times. Asper concluded it would have been physically impossible for Milgaard to rape and murder Gail Miller, talk to Rasmussen at the motel, spend an hour with the Danchuks, and dispose of a flurry of evidence along 21st Street and near Cadrain's house without being spotted. The perpetrator could have tossed Miller's belongings at 7 a.m. if it headed straight to Cadrain's right after the murder, before dawn and before too many people were out and about. But Milgaard did not arrive at Cadrain's house until 9 a.m. It was light out. The midtown streets were abuzz with traffic. Someone easily could have seen Milgaard toss a wallet and blood-soaked Tukey. In his written report, Asper characterized the Crown Prosecutor's case as quote-unquote absurd, which might be an overstatement, but certainly Milgaard would be taking an unnecessary risk tossing the stuff. Yeah, the more it gets poked holes in, the more obvious they are. It's like how easy it is to be poking these holes. It should be mentioned, Asper did all of this at his own expense, and he did not bill Joyce Milgaard for his time. What a legend. Asper returned to Winnipeg and reported his findings to Hirsch Walsh, who said they needed to convince the Canadian Minister of Justice to review the case, and the only way to do that was to come up with a bevy of fresh evidence. If all they had to offer was a reinterpretation of existing evidence, the government wouldn't even bother to look at it, which is fair because in the government's view it's been decided, it's gone through the process. As a good start, Joyce Milgaard produced a written statement from Deborah Hall flatly contradicting the testimonies of Melnick and Lapchuk at the 1970 trial. Hall insisted that David Milgaard had not reenacted the murder. That's a good start, but it's not nearly enough in my opinion. If I was, and I imagine this is what they're going to do, you just build it, because there seems to be a lot of holes. You just line up those holes in a really nicely presented, whatever the equivalent of like a one page was back in the day, or like a PowerPoint presentation, and be like, here we go, please have a look. And then I'm ready to answer any questions. And the evidence is just so overwhelming that they have to say yes. Asper returned to Saskatoon and examined the physical evidence presented at the Milgaard trial. An old shopping cart in the basement of the Saskatoon courthouse contained Gail Miller's blood-stained coat, uniform, and underwear. What the That's how you deal with evidence? Along with the blade and handle of the murder weapon and all the items scattered across Pleasant Hill. But what really caught Asper's eye was the laboratory report about 2 lumps of yellow snow that were determined to contain a man's semen. Further traces of evidence were found inside Gail Miller's vaginal canal. Asper's mind turned to the revolutionary new technique of DNA fingerprinting that had first been used in a criminal case in the UK a few months earlier. Oh, the UK leading the charge on that, are we? Excellent! God save the king. The unfortunate thing was both semen samples from 1969 had been destroyed. Once the case was cold, the lab saw no reason to retain them. In fact, it was a miracle that the other physical evidence was still extant, albeit dumped in an old shopping cart in the basement. I mean, there must have been like many cases. How many shopping carts were there down there? Was this the infinite basement? But as Asper looked at the shopping cart containing Gail Miller's clothing, another thought struck him. If even a fragmentary trace of the killer's semen had transferred from Gail Miller's genitals to her uniform or undergarments while she lay on the ground for an hour after the murder, it could definitively rule out David Milgaard and perhaps even help catch the real killer. It was a long shot, but there was nothing to lose. Yeah, early days of DNA, decades later, and stained onto like some clothes or something, like transferred? I don't know, it's a big ask. At the start of 1987, Hirsch Walsh contacted Dr. James Ferris, the head of forensic pathology at the University of British Columbia, who'd recently taken part in the Lindy Chamberlain inquiry in Australia. She was the mother wrongly convicted of infanticide in 1982 after her baby was likely killed by a dingo. Ferris reviewed Milgaard's case at no charge. Then, after Asper and Walsh successfully applied to the Saskatchewan Queen's Bench to have Gail Miller's clothing analysed, I have to say, I quite admire this Walsh guy. Like, obviously not as much as Asper, but I feel David presented him as he fobbed it off to someone else. No, he gave it to a junior associate or whatever at his company, at his firm, and then when it comes time for, the big guns to come out and for him to make applications and stuff, here he is doing his bit. I like that. Asper's the true legend of the story, but I like that Walsh is stepping in and being like, let's get this done, son. Ferris discovered traces of semen on the victim's undergarments. The problem was, in 1987, DNA testing was too primitive to do anything with samples that small. Again, this would be one of those cases where if I was in prison, I'd just be like reading up on every single fucking thing happening about DNA to be like, when are we getting it tested? I'm looking at the new science. The science is almost here. Nevertheless, Ferris went on to argue that blood evidence used in Milgaard's trial not only failed to link him with the murder, but in fact it might even exonerate him. The yellow snow said to contain semen had antigens from which the Saskatoon lab determined the killer had type A blood. But David Milgaard is among the roughly 20% of people who don't secrete antigens in their semen or saliva. At trial, the prosecution had asserted that Milgaard's own blood must have gotten mixed in with the semen. What? Surely they'd just be torn apart by the defense. Be like, Your Honor, please. Ferris pointed out that that assertion was without foundation. Additionally, the Saskatoon lab that looked at the semen sample in 1969 did not have the ability or equipment at the time to distinguish between type A and type AB blood in a semen sample. If this was type AB, it was not a match to Milgaard. Even if it was type A, Milgaard was hardly the only man in Saskatoon with type A blood. Yeah, we said it's like 34% of them. But it went even further. At minus 40 degrees, human semen does not stain yellow in snow like it does an old Kleenex at room temperature. Gross. It would take urine to do that. And no one had argued that Milgaard stopped for a pee before dumping Miller's body near the same spot. Unneutered dogs, on the other hand, are far more likely to have semen in their urine than humans. The yellow snow was discovered 4 days after the murder. A dog could have slipped into the crime scene at any point in those 4 days and relieved itself. Yeah, this is absurd that this was really considered physical evidence. It should be thrown out, in my opinion. It's absurd. Given urine was the necessary ingredient to create the yellow snow that caught Lieutenant Pencala's eye, it was far more likely dog urine than Milgaard taking a whiz mid-murder. And if the Saskatoon lab mistook dog semen for human semen and concluded a type A blood type, then even for 1969, there was some serious incompetence at play. I completely believe it because I know the facts of this case, because David said he's innocent, but if I was the person who has to reassess this, I'd be like, I don't know, guys. I don't know about that one. Ferris took issue with the idea that a rape could feasibly occur outside at minus 40 degrees Celsius. The idea that a man could maintain an erection when his penis and scrotum would freeze in under a minute and get frostbite between 2 and 5 minutes was a stretch. Wait, so, someone was raped in the cold? We're just arguing over whether it was him, no? It's possible someone would attempt it, but it was much more likely the assailant would drag the victim to a nearby building or vehicle. Something which was supported by the boot that fell off in the alleyway and the shallow cuts on Gail Miller's neck and upper chest, implying she had resisted while being dragged. Okay, sorry, I assumed that the timeline had established that she must have been in the car or something, but I guess not. Yet Nicole John's written statement of May 1969 suggested the rape had taken place in the alley while she watched in horror from the car. She said that Milgaard had stabbed Miller in the alley while the rape was in progress. Then Nicole John said she fled the vehicle and the scene. So it could be that Milgaard dragged Miller inside the car afterward. But there were no traces of Gail Miller's blood found in the Pontiac. If she had been dragged there, stabbed, and parts of the car, the back seat, the floor, would be soaked in her blood. Yeah, of course, she was stabbed a great many number of times. And Ron Wilson and Shorty Cadrain both claimed to see blood on Milgaard's clothes, but also never mentioned anything about the car, despite the fact that they would spend the next several days riding in it. Finally, Dr. Ferris pointed out that the shallow cuts across Gail Miller's neck and upper chest were consistent with the perpetrator holding the knife in his right hand. David Milgaard was left-handed. This is all very basic stuff, guys. This is just such a classic police getting railroaded example. Ferris's final report was completed in September 1988. 2 months later, in December, Asper and Walsh applied to the acting Minister of Justice, Joe Clark, to reopen the Milgaard case. I feel like there needs to be, something I was often thinking about on this channel, I've brought up a few times when we've talked about, doctors and nurses killing their patients, is that there should be a retired detective in the hospital. Someone who just wants to come along, every Wednesday afternoon, because police retire early, right? 50, 55, something like that. My uncle was a policeman. He retired really early. And can't we just do something, and they'd be checking out, the paperwork of the doctors and nurses, just make sure there's no one's killing any babies, that sort of thing. There should be something similar in police, right? Because they get railroaded. They get these ideas. And so you've got the defendant, right? And you think, well, the person to get the police off the railroad is the defense lawyer, who's like, my client's innocent. You guys are thinking this. And then the courts will decide. But the problem is, there's the other person that defense lawyer isn't interested in finding someone else who is actually guilty of the crime. They're just interested in getting their person off. So the police are locked in on, let's say you've got an innocent person like David here. They're locked in on that. The defense attorney's locked in on getting him free. Is anyone really like, well, what about the other guy? There's some other guy out there. I don't know. I feel like there's a problem here. I don't know how to fix it. I got a tiny brain, but yeah. Does that make sense? I guess it's like, well, when they've figured out that he's innocent or whatever, then they'll go look for the main guy. But how about you be looking for the I don't know how to fix this, but it's stupid. I don't like it. The application was completely ignored. Not rejected, it was just ignored. On May the 30th, 1989, David Milgaard, sitting in his cell at Stony Mountain Prison, marked 20 years to the day since he'd last been free. In October 1989, a juror from the Milgaard trial, nearly 2 decades before, named Fernley Cooney, came forward and said that he'd had a mental breakdown in 1962 and was still in and out of mental units in 1969 when he was selected for jury duty. Cooney asserted that he wasn't mentally fit to decide David Milgaard's fate. However, Cooney undercut his own argument by adding that he was the last holdout in the room against a guilty verdict. Calling yourself insane, and in the next breath saying that you were the only person to believe Milgaard was innocent, not exactly compelling stuff. No, I would leave that off the case that you present to get the case reopened. On February the 26th, 1990, a phone call was made to David Asper at the law firm in Winnipeg, but he was on holiday, so Hirschwalsh took the call instead. The caller refused to identify themselves. They asked, quote, "Would you like to know who really killed Gail Miller?" Irritated and expecting a nutcase or a crank call, Hirschwalsh replied, "Yes." Like, sure, mate, why not? I'll hear you. I got 5 minutes before my next meeting. Let's go. Check out a guy called Larry Fisher. He's currently doing time at Prince Albert for a bunch of rapes. He was in Saskatoon in 69. Tracked down his wife. She'll tell you he did it. Then the line went dead. Immediately, Walsh placed a call to David Asper in Florida and asked if he'd ever heard of such a man. Asper replied that is David Asper on holiday? Did we say he was on holiday? He was on holiday. If David Asper's like, I'm coming home. Don't come home, David. But I can imagine this is your kind of, he's like, I'm going to do this right now for free, even though I'm enjoying myself in the Everglades. Asper replied that indeed the man's name had come up in police records for the Miller investigation, but seldom, and he was never investigated as a suspect. Perhaps he should have. Yeah, no shit. Meet Larry Fisher. Lawrence Earl Fisher was born on the 21st of August 1949 in the small town of North Battleford, Saskatchewan, to mother Marie Fisher. His father didn't stick around for long. He was abusive, regularly beating Marie, and he once f***ed her while she was pregnant with Larry. Police eventually ran Larry's father out of North Battleford when Larry was 3 years old. How about you don't run him out? How about you put him in prison for being a rapist? We ran him out of town, so now he's another town's problem. And it's like, yeah, but how about you make him the justice system's problem? No? Wouldn't that be a good idea? From then on, Larry and Marie were on their own. Marie once described Larry's upbringing in quite positive terms. He always kept his room clean, helped out in the garden, was a talented hockey player, and adored being in the youth organization, the Sea Cadets. Marie claimed that she could not understand where Larry Fisher's deeply rooted hatred toward women came from. In the early summer of 1967, at the age of 17, Larry Fisher met a 15-year-old girl named Linda Pambrun at a cafe in North Battleford. She lived with her family on a farm about 55 kilometers or 34 miles away near the hamlet of Cando. Fisher laid on the charm, bought her a Coke, and asked her out on a date. Within a few weeks, Fisher asked Linda to quote-unquote go steady. That is the most old-school word I've ever heard. It's like, you're going to go steady with me? It means like having an exclusive relationship, right? Yeah, which means he wanted to be his regular girlfriend. Linda was thrilled. They would spend hours together at the park or horse riding together, and sometimes Fisher would come over to the family farm to help Linda's father with hay baling. They wrote each other love letters. They discussed getting married. This all sounds really nice, except we know that Larry's a fucking psycho rapist. By the end of the summer, the hypothetical nature of those discussions was removed when Linda discovered that she was pregnant. On December the 24th, 1967, after just a few months of knowing each other, Larry and Linda were married at the 3rd Avenue United Church in North Battleford, with all their relatives from their extended families present. Linda was heavily pregnant and showing a baby bump. Their daughter, Tammy, was born on April the 25th, 1968, 4 months after the wedding. And 5 months premature. Just joking. Larry and Linda Fisher moved to Saskatoon, where Larry got a grunt job hauling materials on various construction sites. Larry, Linda, and Tammy lived in a one-room apartment on Avenue F with a bathroom down the hall that they shared with other tenants. Linda cooked the family meals on a hot plate. Larry would work long hours during the day, but instead of coming home, he more often than not went to the bar afterwards and got absolutely shit-faced. Multiple times in the first few months of their marriage, Larry cheated on Linda, inevitably getting caught. Oh no, so it's like Larry seems like all of this seems so nice. I mean, obviously we know that he's a psycho, so that's fine, but it's like, oh, this is going well, and it's like, oh no, he quickly becomes a complete piece of shit, doesn't he? Oh no, Larry, why? The couple argued frequently. They started beating on each other. Usually it was open palms and fists, but Linda once threatened to stab Larry to death with a butcher's knife. Larry once kicked Linda in the head. Some people are just so broken. Like, good lord. In the autumn of 1968, the Fisher family moved from their squalid little apartment on Avenue F and rented a basement suite on Avenue O. The upstairs landlords were the Cadrain family. Oh. On the evening of October the 21st, 1968, at 7:30 p.m., Larry Fisher, now 19, had been at the bar for a couple of hours after work and was prowling around Avenue H. Oh, is the age of consent in Canada 18? For some reason, I just assumed it was 21 like America, but, different country. For now, he saw a 20-year-old woman, whose identity is protected by law, exit a convenience store with a bottle of pop. Fisher followed her for a few blocks, grabbed her, put his hand over her mouth and a knife to her throat. He said he'd kill her if she screamed. Then he dragged the woman down an alleyway. The woman's glasses fell off as Fisher manhandled her, and once they arrived in a dark corner of the alleyway, he pulled the woman's shirt over her head and stuffed part of it in her mouth. Fisher was in the process of sexually assaulting the victim when something spooked him, and he quickly fled. The woman ran a block and a half to her house and called the police. She was treated for cuts around her neck and underwent what we'd today call a kit procedure, though the practice had not become standardized back then, at St. Paul's Hospital. She was not able to identify the perpetrator, but she noted that it had been wearing construction clothes and a hard hat. Hello, Larry, you piece of shit. 3 weeks later, at 8 p.m. on November the 13th, 1968, a 17-year-old girl was walking from her house on Avenue E to her boyfriend's place on Avenue H. Fisher was again on the prowl. He passed the teenager on the sidewalk and immediately spun around and put a knife to her throat. This time, it did not pierce the victim's skin. Fisher dragged the girl into the darkened backyard and ordered the girl to lay on the ground flat on her stomach. He tore off the girl's clothes and assaulted her. Afterward, Fisher quickly left, taking the girl's clothing with him. The girl ran home naked. The police were called. She was taken to hospital and given a precursor of a kit procedure. Again, she was not able to identify her attacker, but took note of his construction clothes and hard hat. 2 weeks later, on the evening of November the 29th, 1968, a 19-year-old female university student was walking home from the library on the east side of Saskatoon, on the other side of the South Saskatchewan River from Pleasant Hill. She walked past Larry Fisher, who was again wearing his construction clothes and hard hat. Larry is a construction worker. He is so brazen with this that you'd almost assume that the construction clothes are an outfit. Not an outfit, a costume, some sort of disguise. But no, he's just that stupid. Fisher stopped the young woman and asked for directions. The 19-year-old said she wasn't able to help him and kept walking. Fisher followed her. He grabbed her from behind, put his hand over her mouth and a knife to her neck. He dragged her into an alleyway, demanding that she come to a nearby car, which wasn't parked in the alley but on the adjoining street. The 19-year-old struggled the entire time, receiving a deep cut to her hand in the process. Then a carload of male university students drove into the alleyway. Fisher fled immediately. Yes. Like, hey, you! I just love that vigilante. And you can imagine a bunch of, big boys, and they're just like, going down. We're going to take care of this, lads. They'll be like, get out the car. Awesome. I'd like to, they catch him, they beat the shit out of him, and no one cares. The victim was taken to hospital and treated for the cut on her hand, but she was not treated for sexual assault. Fisher had been interrupted before he could do anything truly dire. She was not able to identify her assailant, but, like the others, took note of his construction clothes and hard hat. 14 rapes occurred in Saskatoon in 1968, a major spike in the statistics, and Saskatoon was not a dangerous town. It is possible that Fisher was responsible for more than just those 3. At 7 a.m. on January the 31st, 1969, Larry Fisher had stayed out all night after work. The weather was a vile minus 40 degrees Celsius and Fahrenheit, but Fisher had borrowed a 1958 Chevy from his uncle-in-law, Cliff Panbram, to shelter himself from the elements. This is the past. It's like the 1950s. He's like, yeah, no, how did you get to the pub? Oh, I drove because it was bloody freezing. And gets absolutely faced, drives home. I always remember that scene in Mad Men where the dude with white hair, Sterling, he's having dinner at Don Draper's house, gets absolutely faced, walks out the front door to his car. Don Draper just calls out, "That's my car, yours is the other one." Just because he's so drunk he can't recognize his own car and he's going to drive home. Oh, God. The past. From his car, Fisher spotted 20-year-old Gail Miller walking down 21st Street. A car containing 3 teenagers pulled up alongside her to ask for directions. Gail Miller shook her head, unable to help them, and turned down a T-shaped alleyway connecting 21st Street, Avenue O, and Avenue N. The teenagers drove on. Fisher quickly pulled the 58 Chevy into the alleyway behind the young women. He got out. After Larry Fisher and stabbed Gail Miller, he rolled her out of the now blood-soaked backseat of the car and dumped her in the alleyway. Given the nature of Gail Miller's injuries, she probably laid in the snow for about 15 minutes before she died. Meanwhile, Fish put the car in reverse and quickly fled the scene. Then he realized he still had many of Gail Miller's possessions in the back of the car. He tossed a pair of surgical scissors, the keys to Gail Miller's boarding house, along with the handle to the murder weapon, the paring knife, by the side of the road as he made his way down 20th Street. He then stopped and placed Gail Miller's purse in a trash can. As he approached the Cadrain residence, he tossed Gail Miller's wallet into a snowbank and a blood-stained 2K into the next-door neighbor's yard. It was a fairly sloppy bit of evidence disposal. It's not evidence disposal, you're just spreading the evidence around. Disposal's burning that shit, dude, what the fuck? And it led right back to where he lived. But Fisher was not a practice murderer. He was a 19-year-old serial rapist whose victim had fiercely resisted. Fisher quietly slipped down the outside stairs into the basement suite, and without waking his 17-year-old wife, hopped in the shower. He left his blood-stained coat, clothes, and boots out in the communal laundry room. While Fisher was in the shower, Shorty Cadrain's little sister Rita, only 6 years old, came downstairs to the laundry room to find a sweater to wear to school. He saw the pile of bloody clothing. She ran upstairs. Fisher emerged from the shower shortly thereafter and put on new clothes, a light coat, and some tennis shoes. He scooped up the bloody clothes, coat, and winter boots, put them in a bag, and headed back outside on the 58 Chevy. Moments later, Mrs. Cadrain came downstairs with her daughter and could not see any bloody clothing. Rita insisted the clothes were there, but her mother simply did not believe her. Rita had been telling her mother for months that she didn't like the Fishers, and Mrs. Cadrain suspected this was a tall tale. They did not speak of it again until many years later. That's one of those things where you think about that, and it wouldn't be on your radar for years, and then you'd be like, oh yeah, wait, am I making that memory up? Because the memories are like really dodgy. But yeah, interesting, right? Meanwhile, Larry Fisher was busy out in the car, wiping blood off the backseat and floor using old rags and a wool blanket. He managed to remove all visible signs of blood, but the car certainly would not have stood up to forensic analysis. Dude, you gotta burn your car. That's your only option, you gotta burn that shit. Trace amounts of blood would have inevitably seeped underneath the cushions of the back seats and into the nooks and crannies along the doors and floor. If an ultraviolet light had been used, the interior probably would have lit up like a Christmas tree. Yeah, dude, you gotta be like, someone stole my car, joyriders, and they dumped it in the woods and set it on fire. Those assholes. Fisher drove the car several blocks to his uncle-in-law's place and put the car key under the doormat. Then Fisher went into Cliff Pambram's large backyard and dumped his bloodied clothes, coat, boots, the blanket, and the rags into a steel barrel at the end of it. Fisher doused the items in gasoline and set them alight. He watched the items burn until they were thoroughly charred and practically unrecognizable. The first smart thing he's done, probably in his life. Then Fisher walked back to Cliff Pambram's house and knocked. Fisher explained that he'd been at a party that night and someone had stolen his winter coat and boots. He lied that he'd knocked on Pambram's door several times, but no one answered, so he had lit a barrel fire in his backyard to stay warm while he waited. Pambram gave Fisher a spare coat and boots and sent him on his way. Larry Fisher arrived back at the Cadrain's house sometime after 9 a.m., had slipped back downstairs into the basement suite. According to Linda Fisher, at that point, David Milgaard and his friends had already arrived and were talking to Shorty Cadrain upstairs. Linda was listening to the radio and had just heard the first reports of a woman being found murdered in an alley only a few blocks away from where they lived. Yeah, someone was murdered on the next street over from where I lived. There was a big police thing. It was some guy had some mental troubles. He was just he was just deranged or whatever. He was paranoid or something. And he walks into a government office and he kills one of the government workers over some dispute or something that wasn't even real or something. It was very strange. And then he got arrested. And yeah, but that was pretty intense. Just like on the street next door. Linda was furious that husband had stayed out all night, and so when Larry came into the basement flat, they inevitably argued. Where had he been? Where had he been all night when he should have been home with his wife and daughter? Was he drinking? Was he cheating again? During the course of the argument, Linda pointed out that a paring knife was missing. Out of pure indignation, and not with any degree of seriousness, Linda accused her husband of being out, God knows where, probably stabbing that poor girl she'd heard about on the radio. Oh, hell, Jesus, that's on the nose. Linda later said, "My angry accusation stopped him cold. He looked at me like a guilty person who'd just been caught. The color drained from his face, and he looked shocked and scared. I'll never forget his expression. I know that my accusation was prompted by my anger and not really a belief that he had murdered someone. But his reaction was strange. I recall thinking at the time that this strange behavior was caused by his disbelief that I would say or even think something so horrible as that." Oh my God, that's so wild. That's so wild. A few days later, on February the 5th, at 6:59 a.m., police officers were canvassing the neighborhood for witnesses when they came across Larry Fisher sitting at a bus stop at the corner of 20th Street and Avenue O on his way to work at the construction site. He was waiting for the same bus that Gail Miller had been trying to reach when he had murdered her on January 31st. The cops asked Fisher his name and address. The fact that Fisher lived at Shorty Cadrain's house never caught the attention of the investigators. It was just an address scrawled in some beat cops' notes. The cops asked Fisher where he'd been on the morning of January 31st, and he replied that he'd caught the 6:30 a.m. bus to work at the construction site, an alibi that would not have stood up to scrutiny. The cops asked him if he owned a car, since indistinct tire marks had been found in the alleyway on the morning of Gail Miller's murder. Fisher truthfully replied that he didn't, and did not mention that he frequently borrowed a car from his uncle-in-law. And that was the last time police would talk to Larry Fisher about the murder of Gail Miller for over 2 decades. On the plus side, we do know he's in prison for other shit though, right? Which is at least that's nice. The Frog and the Scorpion. Larry Fisher had been sloppy and he knew it. For the next several months, while police investigated the crime, Fisher kept his head down. Even after David Milgaard's arrest in 1969, Fisher did still not resume his predatory activities as a serial rapist. But after Milgaard was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison on January the 31st, 1970, it wasn't long before Fisher started up again. On the evening of February the 21st, 1970, a mere 3 weeks later, an 18-year-old high school student was on the bus home from a part-time job in the city in a cafe in Saskatoon City Hospital. The bus traveled into Pleasant Hill. The young woman disembarked at the corner of 20th Street and Avenue W. Larry Fisher followed her. He no longer wore his construction clothes or a hard hat when he was on the prowl. The police were still on the lookout for a perpetrator of that description, but Fisher would wear a pair of orange work boots, potentially betraying his profession. Jesus Christ, Larry, you can't afford like another pair of shoes to stay out of fucking prison, Larry? Tiny, smooth brain. Fisher grabbed the young woman on the sidewalk, put his hand over her mouth, and pulled her into a darkened backyard. He didn't put a knife to his throat, having become wary of how that method of persuasion could escalate things if the girl resisted. As it was, the girl screamed a little, so Fisher punched her several times in the face and threatened to break her neck. Fisher tore off her sweater and skirt and whipped her. He fled immediately after. Once again, the victim could not identify her attacker, but she did remember those orange boots. Meanwhile, Larry Fisher walked several blocks east to the basement flat in Shorty Cadrain's house, where he surprised his wife Linda by coming home at a reasonable hour for once. A month later, the construction company Fisher worked for was recruiting men for a project in Winnipeg. It was a temporary job, but it paid extra, so Fisher jumped at the chance. Linda and Tammy stayed behind in Saskatoon. Fisher's uncle-in-law, Cliff Pambram, I didn't even know uncle-in-law was a thing. Is that like... That's like the uncle of your wife? All right. Cliff Pambram remembers that Fisher was a ladies' man who would randomly take off some nights. Wait, but this is your wife's uncle. He's not like, listen, dear, you might want to know something. On the evening of August the 2nd, 1970, a 19-year-old nursing student was walking home in South Winnipeg when she was approached by Larry Fisher, who asked her for directions. A moment later, he grabbed her from behind, put his hand over her mouth, and told her he had a knife on him. Still cautious, he did not brandish it. Fisher dragged her into her vacant lot, punched her several times in the face, stripped her, and bound her limbs with her own clothes. After it was over, he stole $15 from her purse and fled. The victim was discovered by 3 young boys from the neighborhood. They untied her, took her to a nearby home, draped her in a blanket, and called the police. Fisher wasn't going to stop until he was stopped. And with such a brazen MO, Fisher's luck wasn't going to hold out forever. On September the 19th, 1970, at 1 a.m., an 18-year-old dentistry student got off the bus 4 blocks from her home. She had been drinking and dancing with her boyfriend in a bar in downtown Winnipeg. Fisher came up behind her, grabbed her, and put a knife to her throat. It was a return to form, with Fisher's caution having faded in the 9 months since he killed Gail Miller. He dragged the victim between 2 houses. She screamed and struggled, and in the process, Fisher dropped the knife in a flower bed. The outside lights of one of the houses came on. Fisher ignored them and continued the sexual assault, but police officers arrived minutes later. Fisher was arrested and taken to the station. Game over, mate. You're going to prison for a long time. A few hours later at dawn, Larry Fisher was questioned by Detective Lorne Huff, who asked Fisher how he could do such a thing to a young woman when he himself had a daughter back home. An excellent question, because he's a broken psycho. Huff told Fisher that they found his fingerprints on the paring knife that had dropped in the flower bed. He also matched the description of the assailant of a 19-year-old woman on August the 2nd. Larry Fisher, now 21, immediately confessed to 2 rapes in Winnipeg. He blamed the monstrous urge to do such things on his drinking. Not an excuse, because you're choosing to drink. A few days later, 2 police detectives arrived from Saskatoon with a list of unsolved sexual assault cases, given that Fisher was a former resident of the city. He confessed to 4 of them, committed between October 21st, 1968 and February 21st, 1970. He did not admit to the attack on Gail Miller. Back in Saskatoon, Linda Fisher was shocked to find out that her husband was a serial rapist. She's going to be extra shocked when she finds out he's a murderer. Didn't we say that he raped her while she was pregnant? Wait, so why? I mean, isn't that... Look, I don't know. All right, let's just move on. It's not her fault, is it? She immediately began to contemplate the morning of January the 31st, 1969. Larry had been out all night. Her paring knife was missing. He had turned pale when she'd accused him of killing Gail Miller. The puzzle pieces clicked together. Linda knew, but could not prove, that he had done it. Oh my God, just find out. Oh, my husband's a murderer. I gotta get out. She began telling her friends and family as much. I mean, her own family, of course, not Larry's. Many of them told her not to go to the police unless she had evidence. Linda also told her GP, who said conspiratorially that if David Milgaard had been convicted after a corrupt investigation, the cops were probably protecting someone high up in power and not to get involved. Linda, still only 19, followed everyone's advice. Yeah, because she's 19. You'd be like, all right, doc, sure, thanks for the advice. But, wow. All these people are so young. They got kids and murderous husbands. It's weird. I feel very old. I feel like there's so much terrible life experience. Not even a kid, obviously. But it's a lot at a young age, isn't it? Larry Fisher awaited trial at Headingley Prison outside Winnipeg, where the other inmates tormented him brutally, given his status as a self-confessed sex offender. In May 1971, Fisher pleaded guilty to the 2 rapes in Winnipeg and was sentenced to 13 years in prison. Fisher was then transferred to Regina, not Saskatoon, where he pleaded guilty to the 3 rapes and the 1 attempted rape, which had been interrupted by a carload of male university students. The judge sentenced him to 12 years and 6 months, but showed mercy by making them concurrent to his 13-year Winnipeg sentence. That's very unnecessarily nice of you. He's a violent rapist. I'd be very happy for him to be in prison for 25 years, thank you very much. This was mostly on account of the fact that Fisher had freely confessed to all 6 of the crimes. In a particularly disgraceful act, or rather lack of action, so reluctant were the Saskatoon police to dredge up publicity for the attacks between October 68 and February 1970 that they did not inform the 4 victims of the Saskatoon assaults that their cases had been solved. Are you shitting me? They would only find out 2 decades later. What the fuck? Those people are probably stewing on that. I mean, what the fuck? As a result, 4 traumatized victims spent more than 20 years looking over their shoulders. That is absolutely insane. They should sue the shit out of that police department. Meanwhile, after his sentencing in Regina in May 1971, Fisher was transferred to Prince Albert Penitentiary in Saskatchewan, the same prison which, until March 1972, and again between 1974 and 1976, would also house David Milgaard. They saw each other, but never spoke. Despite her husband turning out to be a serial predator, despite Linda Fisher suspecting him of murdering Gail Miller, and despite all the arguments, infidelity, and domestic violence, Linda stayed married to Larry Fisher after his conviction. Oh my God, Linda. I know it's not your fault, you're probably broken in your own way, but Jesus Christ, you are sure that he murdered someone, and he's in prison for 12 years for being a violent therapist. And you're like, oh, but I still love him. What the fuck? She still loved him and visited him occasionally, but Linda also neglected to mention that she'd gotten a boyfriend. Only in 1976, when that boyfriend got Linda pregnant, was there no point continuing the charade, and she filed for divorce, finally. On January the 6th, 1980, Larry Fisher was paroled from prison after serving 9 years and 3 months of his 13-year sentence. His confessing to the crimes after his arrest and his display of remorse and contrition during his parole hearing served him in good stead. Around the same time, David Milgaard was struggling to get paroled from his life sentence for killing Gail Miller, his efforts being crippled by the fact that he still maintained his innocence. Fisher returned to North Battleford to live with his mother Marie. He did not see Linda in person, but he arranged to speak to his now 11-year-old daughter Tammy once a week over the phone. 2.5 months later, on March 31st, 1980 at 9 p.m., 56-year-old woman was walking to her home in North Battleford. Larry Fisher leapt from behind a garden hedge, grabbed the woman, put a knife to her neck, and dragged her into the yard of a vacant house. The woman grabbed at the knife and it cut through the glove and the middle finger. Fisher the woman in the yard, then dragged her into the empty house, and did it again. He then bound the woman's hands with a pantyhose and her legs with a nylon scarf. But then, as Fisher went through the woman's purse in search of money, she asked him, "How can you do such horrible things? How would you like it if this happened to your mother?" Fisher replied, "Never mind my mother. I spent 10 years in jail for doing this same thing. Only now, I'm going to slit your throat." Fisher stuffed the woman's undergarments into her mouth and dragged her into another room. Then, sure enough, he slit her throat. When that failed to kill her, he stabbed the woman several times in the chest, and when that failed to kill her, Fisher attempted to suffocate her by putting his hands over her mouth and nose. She briefly lost consciousness, and Fisher backed away. Suddenly, the woman woke up, but before Fisher could grab her, she managed to free her legs from the nylon scarf and run out the back door of the house and to the neighboring residence, which thankfully was occupied. Bleeding profusely from her neck and chest, the woman banged on the back door with her elbow and screamed for help. She was ushered inside, and neighbors called an ambulance. The woman was rushed to hospital in critical condition and nearly died on the operating table, but she survived. Immediately after the operation, North Battleford police barged into a hospital room and asked about the assault. The woman was heavily sedated but capable of speech. She related what her attacker had said about doing 10 years in jail. That is easily enough to find out who it was. How many people are released having served 10 years in jail? I mean, it can't be that many, can it? The statement immediately gave police their suspect. There we go. There was only one man in the town of North Battleford who had done roughly a decade in prison for attacking women, and that, of course, was Larry Fisher. Before dawn, on April the 1st, police arrived at Marie Fisher's house to find her son in the basement, washing blood off of his boots. They also found some of the victim's clothes hidden under the floorboards. They had caught Larry Fisher banged to rights. But this time, Fisher did not confess. He demanded the case go to trial. There were no eyewitnesses to the attack itself. Nobody had seen Fisher except for the victim, and Fisher grew a moustache for the trial in an attempt to hinder her from making a positive identification. Can't they just be like, shave it off? Shave that moustache off, right? Can't the court order something like that? I know it's rather bizarre, but they should. But then, at the preliminary trial hearing in October 1980, the Crown prosecutor introduced testimony from an RCMP officer who had taken Fisher from North Battleford to Saskatoon for a psych assessment the day of his arrest. Constable Charles Thompson testified that Larry Fisher had confessed the attempted murder to him and had discussed it at length, along with the fact that it was lucky, in a way, that the woman hadn't died, or he'd be looking at a much longer sentence. Fisher and his lawyer realized they were cooked. They struck a plea deal. In November 1980, Fisher pleaded guilty to rape and attempted murder in exchange for a 10-year sentence, in addition to serving out the remaining 3 years and 9 months of his previous sentence, a total of 13 years and 9 months, assuming, of course, that Fisher wasn't paroled again. Meanwhile, in November 1980, David Milgaard was recovering in hospital after being shot in the arse in Toronto and after 2.5 months on the lam from prison. His mother, Joyce Milgaard, cashed in a $10,000 RRSP and offered it as a reward for information leading to the arrest of the murder of Gail Miller. In December 1980, the Milgaard family spread pamphlets about the reward all over Saskatoon. And that is how Linda Pambram, formerly Linda Fisher, became aware of Joyce Milgaard's efforts to free her son. Linda was, of course, already aware of the atrocity that her ex-husband had committed in North Battleford after being freed from jail. It was startlingly similar to the murder of Gail Miller back in '69, but seeing the pamphlet in her mailbox reminded Linda that for nearly 12 years an innocent man had been locked up in prison for a crime that Larry Fisher almost certainly committed. With her boyfriend's encouragement, that same day Linda went down to the Saskatoon police station and gave a one-page written statement listing her reasons why she suspected her ex-husband of Gail Miller's murder. The similar MO, the fact that Fisher was an active serial rapist at the time, the trail of evidence leading to their house, the missing paring knife, the fact that he was out all night, and of course Fisher's reaction to Linda's angry accusation of murder. The Saskatoon police did nothing. The case was not reopened. Larry Fisher was not even questioned about it. In fact, it would be another decade before anyone took this claim seriously. And at that point, it sure as wasn't the Saskatoon police. Like, I do believe they should have looked into this, but they could also be like, oh, it's just a spurned wife or something. She's just upset that her husband turned out to be a massive piece of... But still, dudes, you should look into this. There's a dude in prison for a really long time for something he didn't do. That's not okay. The courtship of Kim Campbell. On February the 26th, 1990, Winnipeg criminal lawyer Hirsch Walsh got an anonymous tip about Larry Fisher. There we go. He immediately reported it to his junior colleague, David Asper, who was on vacation. Asper cut his vacation short, course he did, legends, and went back to Winnipeg, where he confirmed that Fisher was indeed a serial rapist doing time at Prince Albert Penitentiary. Asper contacted Joyce Milgaard. She'd spent a decade poring over the investigation files and immediately recognized the name. Larry Fisher had been interviewed by the police while waiting at a bus stop in February 1969. The anonymous tipster had said that Fisher's ex-wife, Linda Pambram, would be able to confirm that he had killed Gail Miller. Joyce Milgaard contacted Jim McCloskey, who ran a charity called Centurion, an organization that advocated for wrongly convicted prisoners. McCloskey offered to pay the substantial fee of a private investigator, Paul Henderson, to go and talk to Linda Pambram. Excellent, I like it. Henderson and Joyce tracked Linda Pambram to the hamlet of Cando, not far from the farm where Linda had grown up. They decided to show up on Linda's doorstep unannounced. They arrived and were let in by Linda's 14-year-old son. His mother would be home soon. When Linda arrived, she was shocked to learn the Milgaard's family had never been notified by Saskatoon police of the written statement she had submitted back in 1980. Linda immediately recounted her version of events and what had happened when Fisher returned home on the morning of Gail Miller's death. Linda and Joyce met again in Saskatoon on March the 11th, 1990, along with David Asper, and they pored over the details of Linda's 1980 written statement. Then they drafted a longer statement that Joyce and her lawyers would submit as part of the ongoing application to the Ministry of Justice to review David Milgaard's case. Linda hesitated briefly before signing it. Larry Fisher was due to get out of prison in 1994, and she was worried that he might harm her out of revenge, but she signed it. On March the 15th, 1990, Asper submitted Pambram's new statement to the Federal Ministry of Justice. Asper appended a note to the statement where he pointed out that the slashes around Gail Miller's throat and upper torso were consistent with a right-handed use of the weapon. David Milgaard was left-handed. Larry Fisher was right-handed. I hope there's lots more, like all sorts of stuff. Like, here's reason 1, and here's reason 2, and carry on, here's reason 36. Why you should reopen this case. Overwhelm them with evidence or doubt. In May 1990, the private investigator Paul Henderson travelled to Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, where Shorty Gudrone was now living. He was quasi-homeless and quite mentally ill. Is he the guy who was like, I'm the son of God? He divorced his wife after a domestic violence incident where she had grabbed a knife and cut off the tip of his nose. Holy shit. Thereafter, he followed his brother Dennis to British Columbia, where Dennis allowed Shorty to sleep in the treehouse in their backyard. All right. Shorty was apparently too unstable to be allowed to stay in the house around Dennis Gudrone's family. Shorty did not want to talk to Henderson, so the private investigator talked to Dennis instead. Henderson learned from Dennis that Shorty had initially claimed that Milgaard was innocent, but Saskatoon police had put intense pressure on him, so Shorty changed his story and claimed the $2,000 reward. Dennis also revealed that during Milgaard's trial in 1970, Shorty was already having hallucinations about God, Jesus, the Virgin Mary, and the serpent in the garden. None of that was revealed at trial, of course, because it would have reduced Shorty's credibility as a witness. Yeah, or the fact that he was pressured into it by the police. They're like, if you say this, not only do you help us out, you help yourself out. And you also get $2,000, which was like, what, a lot more money in today's money. It was a lot more money back then, basically. 4 years after trial, Shorty was committed to a psychiatric institution. Dennis Gudrone wrote out a statement, signed it, and handed it to Paul Henderson. On June the 4th, 1990, Paul Henderson tracked down Ron Wilson to the tiny village of Nakusp, smack dab in the middle of the Rocky Mountains in British Columbia. A beautiful spot, but very much the middle of nowhere. And that was by design. Wilson had kicked his drug habit around 1980. He now worked for a tire company and went by his middle name of Dale. Nobody in Nakusp knew Wilson's connection to David Milgaard and Gail Miller. Probably for the best. He's probably just out there, trying to move past his past, it seems. I mean, good for him. Wilson was alarmed that the private investigator had found him, but he did agree to talk. It turns out, this turns into an 8-hour tape-recorded interview where Ron Wilson was in tears at the end. The upshot of it was this. Wilson was heavily coerced by police, and pretty much everything he said in the 1970 trial was a lie. Wilson also gave Henderson some idea of the equal or greater pressure Nickel-John had been put under, being dragged down to a police cell block 2 nights in a row. As Henderson turned to leave, Wilson asked, "Is there any chance that I could talk to David and apologize for what I did?" The next day, David Milgaard phoned Ron Wilson from Stony Mountain Prison. He accepted Wilson's apology. David Milgaard is a big, high-road motherfucker. Yes. God, it's so sad. Fuck that. This system. This. The police. Meanwhile, Henderson moved on to Penticton, British Columbia, in an effort to track down Nickel-John, now, as mentioned before, going by Nickel Demian. Henderson was only able to track down Nickel's parents, who refused to let him speak to her. So Henderson went back to Port Coquitlam, where he found Shorty Cadrain to be in a more talkative mood. So Henderson bought Shorty a coffee and got him to agree to submit to a written statement. Shorty still insisted that he had seen blood on Milgaard's clothing that morning in 1969, but went on to describe the police coercion he was subjected to initially. As far as Henderson was concerned, this was better than nothing. Before leaving British Columbia, Henderson tried to get an interview with Craig Lapchuk, one of the late witnesses in the 1970 trial, who claimed that David Milgaard had reenacted the murder of Gail Miller by stabbing a pillow. Lapchuk initially told Henderson that he'd got the wrong person, but when Henderson persisted, Lapchuk basically told Henderson to piss off because he was about to have sex with his girlfriend. Classy, dude. Classy. Meanwhile, on June the 7th, the Winnipeg Free Press ran a story where Ron Wilson claimed that he'd been coerced by police to give false testimony against David Milgaard. 2 weeks later, on June the 21st, CBC National News ran a story on how Larry Fisher might have been the actual killer. CBC National News. I hope you were using a lot of allegedlys. After that, the media just ran with the story throughout the summer of 1990. Even American television crews started showing up to cover the story. To no small measure, all this media attention put pressure on the Canadian government to take Milgaard's application for review more seriously. Good. Love some journalism. Keeping people honest. In July, a former cellmate of Fisher's came forward, claiming that Fisher had confessed to him that he'd killed Gail Miller. CBC verified the man had indeed done time with Fisher, but kept his identity private. In August, Larry Fisher gave an interview from prison for the CBC show The Fifth Estate in order to defend himself. Fisher denied killing Gail Miller. He said that he'd only found out about the case earlier in 1990 after he'd been accused of it. The interviewer pointed out that Fisher had actually been interviewed by police about the murder in 1969. Gotcha! Fisher said he'd forgotten about that. Then he claims, much like in 1969, that he'd caught the 6:30 a.m. bus to work at the construction site that day. By 1990, there were no more records from the construction company to check his alibi. And Fisher added, quote, "The cops have already had my name on file for 21 years. Now, if they had concrete evidence, why didn't they charge me 21 years ago? Why indeed? Why indeed?" Fisher's interview didn't go down well with the public. He seemed cagey, tense, and dishonest. Public sympathies were now firmly on David Milgaard's side. Calls for his release grew louder. In September 1990, David Asper approached Manitoba's chief medical examiner, Peter Markesten, to provide a second opinion on the serological evidence that had condemned David Milgaard at trial, which was just nonsense. It was just completely wrong. That was the person who was like, oh yeah, it could be semen or dog's urine, I don't know. I didn't go to university. The following month, in a written report, Markesten concurred with the opinion of Dr. James Ferris that the yellow snow had failed to link the murder to David Milgaard. Meanwhile, in Canadian Parliament, Justice Minister Kim Campbell was questioned about the nearly 2-year delay in the review of Milgaard's case. Campbell blamed the delay on the submission of new witness statements. Liberal MP John Harvard replied by calling her the Minister of Excuses. Shortly thereafter, Kim Campbell visited Winnipeg to give a speech at a private luncheon. Joyce Milgaard stood outside the room and tried to give her some files on her son's case to read. Campbell, avoiding eye contact, told Joyce, "I'm sorry, but if you want your son to have a fair hearing, don't approach me personally." And then she brushed past Joyce into the room. Fair enough? This incident was widely reported on in the media, with Campbell mostly depicted as cold and unfeeling to a mother's plea. She's also got to separate. This isn't like she is professional. Like, she might be the minister of excuses or whatever, but in that situation, I think that's fine. Like, she's like, you have to do this through the right channels. I'm really sorry. That's okay. Meanwhile, bureaucrats in the ministry seem to be working as slow as possible, and according to witnesses they interviewed, seem to be determined to defend Milgaard's original conviction. Right, that's not okay, though, is it? One of the original Saskatoon investigators, Eddie Cast, came out and denied using any undue coercion on Cadrain, Wilson, or John. He added, "I was convinced then, and still am, that we got the proper person. Everything that's come out hasn't changed my mind one iota. I'd have to see more compelling evidence to change my mind." All these witnesses, like Nicol, Cadrain, and Wilson, all said at the time that they were afraid of Milgaard. They are still scared. End quote. Then, a man named Ben Dozenko, an employee at Stony Mountain Prison, came forward. Dozenko had been David Miller's custodian on August the 22nd, 1980, the day of Milgaard's visit to his family in Winnipeg. Milgaard's sister, Maureen, had tricked Dozenko into leaving them alone for 5 minutes, during which Milgaard made his escape. Dozenko now claimed to the media that David Milgaard had confessed to him that he had killed Gail Miller. He did not report his confession at the time, and there's no surviving paperwork. And it would make Dozenko the only man on the face of the planet to whom Milgaard made such a confession, despite the fact that admitting to the murder would have helped David Milgaard immeasurably with the parole board. Instead, he insisted on his innocence. On October 1st, 1990, frustrated that Kim Campbell hadn't even looked at Milgaard's case file yet, David Asper and Hirschwald traveled to Ottawa for a meeting with the bureaucrats in the Justice Ministry assigned to the case: Eugene Williams, Bill Corbett, and Bruce McFarlane. I like it. These guys are legends. There's a lot of people in this case who are like, yeah, let's get this done, because the cogs of justice are not turning. The meeting lasted 5 hours and got extremely heated. All three bureaucrats were dead set on the idea that David Milgaard was guilty. In fact, Bill Corbett had previously told the media that Milgaard supporters were similar to nutcases who thought that Elvis Presley was still alive. After hours wrangling over the details of the case, Asper and Walsh left the meeting extremely dejected. In late November, Kim Campbell again returned to Winnipeg, and a reporter inevitably asked why there had been a 2-year delay on the Milgaard review. This time, Campbell blamed the delay on Milgaard's lawyers. In the House of Commons, John Harvard said, "Where does she get this stuff? She's dead wrong. The minister better get a grip on her department. Someone is feeding her a line. It puts justice under a cloud and makes her look like a fool." In response to Campbell's statement, Joyce Milgaard made copies of a report on David's case compiled by the Centurion charity and mailed it to every single last member of Parliament. She added a note, "I know you're probably going home soon to spend time with your family at Christmas. The Milgaard family would also like to be together." Hell yeah. Up to that point, MPs had only been vaguely aware of the details of Milgaard's case. Now the official opposition, en masse, began to use Milgaard as a cudgel with which to beat the government. Kim Campbell in particular. Excellent. On February the 27th, 1991, the office of Kim Campbell issued the following statement. "The Honourable Kim Campbell, Minister of Justice, today announces that she will not intervene in the conviction of David Milgaard for the murder in 1969 of Gail Miller." David Asper said, quote, "I feel like a horrible failure. I didn't succeed. Maybe I did something wrong. I don't know. I just feel a big sense of failure." Joyce Milgaard, meanwhile, said to the press, "We're going to come out fighting. That's all we can do. We'll just start all over again if that's what it takes to prove that David is innocent." It took 2 weeks for David Milgaard to respond publicly from behind the walls of Stony Mountain Prison, quoting him, "My fight and my family's struggle for my freedom is not over. There is no honest explanation for the Justice Department's failure. I now challenge the Justice Department and Kim Campbell to come out from behind closed doors. We challenge them to show the country how it was possible for me to commit the crime at all. Kim Campbell and her department are not worthy, and her integrity is in question." End quote. The day after his public statement, on March 13th, 1991, David Milgaard had a routine hearing before the parole board. He was told, quote, "You must show that you understand what you did and how you hurt someone else." His application for parole was, as always, rejected. Benign treachery. Joyce Milgaard wasn't backing down. The Justice Minister would not review her son's case. The police wouldn't even question Larry Fisher about Gail Miller's murder, so Joyce decided that she would investigate Fisher herself. She got back in touch with Jim McCloskey from the Centurion charity and asked whether it would pay for a private investigator to track down Larry Fisher's confirmed victims. McCloskey immediately consented. Legend. Joyce knew that it would mean getting Fisher's victims to relive horrific moments in their lives, but she really felt like she had no choice. In April 1991, Joyce and Paul Henderson set out on the road. For the next 2 weeks, they spoke to all 7 victims. 4 of them, the ones from Saskatoon, were not even aware that their rapist had been caught 2 decades earlier. Oh my god, I forgot about that. What a fucking nightmare. What is wrong with you? Some were reluctant to talk. Others were thrilled at the prospect of having Fisher put away for life for murder, rather than have him inflicted on society again in 1994. Fisher's final victim, the woman from North Battleford who had suffered the most brutal attack, wanted to burn him to the ground. All 7 victims indicated a similar MO to Gail Miller's attacker. Returning to Winnipeg, Joyce, Paul, and David Asper compiled a detailed file on all of these attacks. This is all going to be very circumstantial though, isn't it? They even included multiple maps to show Fisher's movements between where he was staying, working, and where he assaulted his victims. Times, dates, forensic details, everything. In August 1991, they released all this information to the press. The media response was overwhelming, with the story hitting the front page of all the national newspapers and creating another raft of television features. Several editorials were published demanding that Kim Campbell reverse her decision on Milgaard's case. The flurry of press coverage unearthed something else. A 42-year-old woman living in Toronto came forward and claimed that 22 years earlier, she was a university student living in Saskatoon, and on the morning of January the 31st, 1969, the same day that Gail Miller was murdered, the woman had been walking to the bus stop on the corner of 20th Street and Avenue H when she was attacked. Avenue H was only a few blocks away from the T-shaped alleyway where Gail Miller was killed that same morning. The man approached the 20-year-old university student, grabbed her, and tried to force her down the alleyway. He had a knife in his hand. The young woman screamed and dropped her books and struggled while they were still on the street together. The assailant seemed startled, let her go, and beat a hasty retreat down the alleyway while she continued to scream for help. After seeing the press coverage, the woman now identified the man who attacked her as Larry Fisher. Now, given the media attention on Larry Fisher, it might have just been brushed off as an attention-seeking tall tale. However, the same day she was attacked, the woman reported the incident to the Saskatoon police, and indeed the press confirmed there was a police report from January the 31st, 1969, where the female university student described the details of the attack and the appearance of the attacker: construction clothes and a hard hat, something that Fisher had worn with previous victims. As such, it was distinctly possible that the same morning Gail Miller was killed, Fisher may have aborted another attempt to rape a woman only a few blocks away. Right. And this is all showing that Fisher's a massive piece of shit, but I don't really see... We already know Fisher's a piece of shit. So how is this helping the Milgaard situation? On August the 14th, 1991, David Asper and Hirsch Walsh submitted a second application to have David Milgaard's case reviewed by the Ministry of Justice. The testimony of Fisher's victims and all the connected details were included. But, beyond that, Asper and Walsh included a statement from the surviving members of Gail Miller's family in Laura, Saskatchewan, demanding that there be a review because of the significant reasonable doubt that had arisen in David Milgaard's case. Oh yeah, maybe there wasn't a reasonable doubt back in the day, but now there's loads of reasonable doubt. On September the 5th, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney visited Winnipeg, and his hotel was picketed by Joyce Milgaard and about 30 supporters. Mulroney emerged from the hotel, shook Joyce's hand, and listened to her talk for 3 minutes. Then Mulroney assured her that the new application had been received in Ottawa, was being looked at, and he would be having a word with the Justice Minister, Kim Campbell, when he returned. Awesome. Mulroney, please make this happen. If you are, you're a legend. Mulroney then told Joyce Milgaard that she was very courageous, shook her hand again, and departed. Years later, Kim Campbell would write that she was frustrated by Brian Mulroney's decision to talk to Joyce Milgaard. Well, also, f*** you. And she felt that he had essentially thrown her under the bus. I mean, look, Kim, in my opinion, in this situation, under the bus might be where you belong, allegedly. Metaphorically, of course. Jesus. You gotta be careful.
Simon said that he wanted the Justice Minister of Canada dead.
No! The Prime Minister's office telephoned Stony Mountain Prison, and David Milgaard was transferred to the minimum security Rockwood Institution and granted day pass privileges. Wow. In Prime Minister's office. It's like, you know, in those movies where it's like, you might want to take this call. It's like, I'm busy for the call. It's like, it's the president. The president? And I love it in those movies where it's like the president's so important that your phone rings and they tell you to hold. Like, hold for the president. Awesome. I want to be that powerful. Mulroney would later claim that he told officials in the Justice Ministry in blunt terms that a review of Milgaard's case was warranted. On November 29th, in a public speech in Toronto, Kim Campbell announced that she would still not be reviewing David Milgaard's case, but she would be referring it to the Supreme Court of Canada. Kim Campbell, the Prime Minister. Kim, get it done, Kim. Hirschwalch pointed out at the time that this was Kim Campbell's way of not backing down, but at the same time getting this public relations nightmare off her neck. Walsh also speculated, rather cynically, that perhaps the Justice Minister hoped Milgaard would lose in the Supreme Court. On January the 16th, 1992, the Supreme Court of Canada convened to examine the Milgaard case for the first time. In that day's session, they determined that there was enough reasonable doubt to question Milgaard's conviction, and they ordered him temporarily released from prison. Excellent progress is being made, finally, after oh so many pages. Milgaard himself was required to testify in front of the Supreme Court of Canada. He travelled to Ottawa and stayed in a halfway house for recently released inmates. He had no guard or custodian. His lawyer, Hirschwalch, was accountable for his actions. Milgaard's sister, Maureen, accompanied him on the trip, and they ran up and down the stairs of the halfway house and roughhoused outside in the snow. It was as if they were both children again. For perspective, Milgaard was now 39, and he hadn't been free since the age of 16, almost 23 years prior. Yeah, no wonder this dude's got some arrested development. I mean, holy shit. David Milgaard testified in front of the Supreme Court on January the 21st. Although he was thoroughly prepped by his lawyers, and he naturally felt much pressure was riding on his testimony, all the Supreme Court really wanted to hear Milgaard say was, "I didn't do it," under oath, and they'd take it from there. Subsequently, they heard testimony from Ron Wilson and Nicole Demian, the latter of whom obviously could not evade a summons from the highest court in the land. Ron Wilson came forward, get a summons from the Supreme Court. You're like, oh, I guess I better show up to that one. Ron Wilson came forward and said he'd lied under oath in 1970 and added an additional piece of information that he'd also shamefully applied for the $2,000 reward for information after it implicated Milgaard to police back in 1969. Nicole Demian, meanwhile, stuck to a tactic of claiming she had no memory of anything that happened around that time. It's not bad though, is it? It's like, I don't remember. And they'll be like, you're under oath. It's like, no, I don't remember. It'd be very hard to prove that someone does actually remember. So, not bad. On January the 28th, Milgaard checked into the halfway house at 11 p.m. He subsequently disappeared, and the staff contacted police, and a nationwide warrant was issued for his arrest. What are you doing? Why, Milgaard? Why? It turns out that Milgaard had been sitting on the back step of the halfway house. Oh, thank God. Oh my God, I was really worried. Drinking a case of beer. Legend. He's just out back. He's like, I've been in prison for 20 years. Last time I was in prison, I got into prison when I was 16. I couldn't even have a beer. Just like, I'm going to get up in the garden, yes. He went to bed at 3:20 a.m. An hour later, the staff found him. Although he was not charged for trying to escape or anything like that, prison officials deemed him a flight risk and had him shipped back to Stony Mountain. It was essentially a punishment. He did nothing. He was in the garden. What are you talking about? Why are you punishing him? You just couldn't find him because you didn't look in the fucking garden, you idiots. The hearings resumed on February the 17th, and the Supreme Court heard from several witnesses. But a new one was Calvin Tallis, Milgaard's 1970 defense lawyer. Tallis claimed that Milgaard had told him that he had a knife on him in Saskatoon, something that Milgaard denied, and that he had thrown a woman's cosmetics case out of the window in Alberta. Again, Milgaard denies this. Tallis was going by memory because he'd destroyed the case file some years before. Tallis also claimed that he was not aware that a serial rapist with a similar MO was operating in Saskatoon at the time. What's his motivation for lying? He doesn't really seem to have a motivation for lying, I would guess. Unless he wants to cover up that he didn't do a very good job. But I don't know. Kind of interesting. Then Larry Fisher himself took the stand. He admitted to all 7 sexual assaults that he had committed between 1968 and 1970 and after his parole in 1980. He denied killing Gail Miller, but Hirschwalch forced him to admit that the MO was similar. On April the 14th, 1992, the Supreme Court laid down its ruling. They found that David Milgaard had received a fair trial back in 1970. Oh no! They said that they could find no conclusive evidence that the police coerced witnesses. Oh no! However, they also said that Ron Wilson recanting his testimony and the fact that Larry Fisher was active in Saskatoon at the time justified giving Milgaard a new trial. Oh yes! The Supreme Court ruling also stated that due to 23 years' time served for the murder of Gail Miller, even if David Milgaard was found guilty at the second trial, he should be pardoned. And they stressed that, off the back of their ruling, by no means should Larry Fisher be prosecuted. Why not? Why not? Why not? Why not? It was probably Larry! Allegedly, in my opinion. On April the 15th, 1992, Justice Minister Kim Campbell quashed Milgaard's murder conviction and referred the matter back to the Saskatchewan courts. On April the 16th, the Provisional Government of Saskatchewan declared that it would not prosecute David Milgaard in a second trial. Milgaard was released, a free man after nearly 23 years, but he was not formally acquitted, nor was Larry Fisher prosecuted for Gail Miller's murder. He was still scheduled for release in 1994. A war inevitable, a war eternal. At noon on January the 16th, 1992, David Milgaard walked out of the front gate of Stony Mountain Prison with his sisters Maureen and Susan, with 4 cardboard boxes and 2 duffel bags containing all of Milgaard's possessions in the world. Milgaard gave a very brief statement of 7 words to the media. Quote, "It feels good to be out. Forever." Then, ignoring a blizzard of questions from reporters, they hopped into Maureen's car, the same one that had been used during Milgaard's escape from custody in 1980, and drove into Winnipeg for a family reunion. There was a case of beer in the trunk. Legend. That beer must taste so good. You're like, it's like a long day at work. You come over and you're like, have a nice cup of beer, glass of beer. Cup of beer? What's wrong with me? Glass of beer. Can you imagine being in prison for 20 years? And you're like, I don't know, there's something just about beer. I just love it. Nice ice-cold beer. In March 1993, David Milgaard filed a civil lawsuit against the city of Saskatoon, the Crown prosecutor, and 3 police officers for malicious prosecution. In May, it was escalated to the Court of the Queen's Bench, but it would be many years before the matter was resolved. In the summer of 1994, the RCMP released a report finding no fault in the actions of the Saskatoon police or the Crown prosecutor in the Milgaard case. Milgaard told the press, "I'm really pissed off about this. Everyone is being cleaned up and whitewashed. But on second thought, maybe I shouldn't be surprised." No, I agree with you, David. You shouldn't be surprised, but you should still be angry. Meanwhile, on May the 26th, 1994, Larry Fisher walked out the front gate of Mountain Penitentiary in Agassiz, British Columbia, to decidedly less media fanfare. He was now 44. He immediately travelled 1,000 kilometres north, or 620 miles, to the tiny backwoods town of Dawson's Creek. Wait, like the TV show from the 90s? I never saw Dawson's Creek, but it was very popular when I was a kid. In northern BC, near the tip of the Alaska Highway, the residents soon found out who he was and used a poster campaign to run him out of town in a matter of days. He moved on to the city of Calgary in Alberta, but residents there also made it clear he was unwelcome. Then Fisher returned to Saskatoon, only to get the same treatment there as well. Where's he gonna go? You gotta be like, change your name, change your hairstyle, I don't know, get a face transplant. Not a face transplant. What's it called? Where they like plastic surgery up your face? Like a new eye. Not a new eye. There's a word for it. Disguise? You know, where the plastic surgeon makes you look like someone else. At that point, Fisher gave a media interview where he made a desperate plea to be left alone. He claimed that he regularly attended church, was a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and was enrolled in a sex offender re-education program. He also invited anyone to come to his house for a cup of coffee so they could see what kind of person he was. He said with visible frustration, "How many times do I have to pay? What can I say or do? I have to earn respect, but how can I work my way into life when everyone is trying to push me out?" I don't want to defend this disgusting piece of shit, but also he has served his time, and obviously we should be watching him closely for the rest of his goddamn life, but he should have a second chance, should he? I don't know. God, justice is complicated, isn't it? In May 1995, David Milgaard's legal team announced that thanks to advances in technology, they would be performing DNA tests on the traces of semen found on Gail Miller's underwear in 1987. They hoped they'd be able to exonerate Milgaard once and for all. Behind the scenes, there was a bitter argument between Milgaard's team and the federal government, who wanted the samples tested in an RCMP lab. But Milgaard simply didn't trust them. Yeah, it's like, what happened? Oh yeah, we lost it. All of it. Don't know what happened. Lab fire, mishandling, contamination. I don't know, something happened to it. Do it, David. Sorry, mate. The dispute lasted a further 2 years, with the federal government refusing to allow the samples to be tested at an independent lab. Sue them. Definitely sue them. I think a court would be like, no, independent lab, that's fine. We'll do it with oversight. Thank you. Test it. Save the taxpayer some money. David's going to pay for it. Finally, in May 1997, the government consented to having the semen samples tested by the Forensic Science Services Laboratory in the UK. So can you imagine that sample being on that plane? And David's like, that plane better make it there. Better make it. The tests were scheduled for July of that year. Not only would they test the samples up against Milgaard's DNA, they would also test it against Ron Wilson's DNA, since he was there with Milgaard in January 1969, and thanks to a blood sample voluntarily obtained during the Supreme Court hearings in 1992, the DNA of none other than Larry Fisher. Oh, Larry, it's gonna be you, Larry! At 1 p.m. on July the 18th, 1997, at a press conference in Toronto, David Milgaard's legal team announced the DNA test results. They fully exonerated David Milgaard in the question of Gail Miller's murder. They also did not show a match to Ron Wilson. Not that anybody seriously expected them to. The semen found on Gail Miller's clothing did, however, show a match to the DNA of Larry Fisher. Oh, what? It did? Well, now, Larry, your chances of, reintegration into society, bro, sexual assault and murder, you're fucking back into jail for you, mate. The technology of the time afforded a likelihood ratio of 1 in 800 million people. Larry Fisher immediately fled Saskatoon and drove west. After a week's search, he was found and arrested in Calgary, Alberta on July the 25th, 1997. Oh, Larry, you gotta do better at hiding. You gotta go live in the woods for the rest of your life, Larry, or get to Lebanon ASAP. Meanwhile, in the aftermath of the DNA tests, the powers that be couldn't apologize fast enough. The Saskatoon Police Department apologized, along with one of the officers who worked the case, and the Crown Prosecutor from 1970. Anne McClellan, now the Justice Minister, gave an impassioned speech, calling it a terrible wrong and a miscarriage of justice. The Saskatchewan provincial government offered its apologies, promised to hold an inquiry, and promised David Milgaard copious monetary compensation. They offered him an interim payment of $250,000 or $448,000 in modern money with assurances of much more to come. Excellent, excellent. Is that Canadian dollars or real dollars? Nearly 2 years later, on May the 17th, 1999, the federal and Saskatchewan provincial governments paid David Milgaard $10 million. Yes, please. Or $17.5 million in modern money. Let's go, in compensation for 23 years behind bars for a crime he did not commit. Would I take $17.5 million for 23 years behind bars? Absolutely fucking not. But is it good that he got that? Hell yes. That's a good ass amount of money. That's really good. A few months later, on November 22nd, 1999, Larry Fisher was convicted of the murder of Gail Miller and sentenced to life in prison with no parole until 2010. Oh no! Fisher's final appeal for his conviction was rejected in 2003. In September 2003, the government of Saskatchewan announced it would conduct an inquiry into David Milgaard's case. The inquiry was held over 191 days across 2005 and 2006. 114 witnesses were interviewed, and 3,200 documents were submitted into evidence. The initial transcript filled 40,541 pages, spanning 193 volumes. Good Lord Almighty. On April the 24th, 2006, David Milgaard said to the committee, quote, "I want everyone to know that there are many victims from this tragedy. I hope the court can see this and will offer what help it can for these people. Ronald Wilson and Nicole John are just a few of the many that need this kindness. You know, a lot of the Canadian people come up to us and congratulate us still. I think it's important for you to know that David Milgaard, Joyce Milgaard, they're not as important as what you see in these people's faces. You see the love in their faces, and what that is really is them caring for what's right and what's just. I think that's important for Canada. Thank you." Very well said. On September the 26th, 2008, the inquiry released an 800-page report finding no conclusive evidence of any professional misconduct by police officers or prosecutors, but the report called for the creation of an independent committee to investigate allegations of wrongful convictions. The committee was finally set up 11 years later in 2019, and David Milgaard was among those appointed to sit on it. I love that. David Milgaard can do whatever he wants. He's fucking rich now. And he's like, I'm going to sit on that committee. That's dope. David, mad respect. When the serial rapist and murderer Larry Fisher first came up for a parole in 2010 and David's sitting there. Fuck you, Larry. Fuck you. He refused to participate in the hearing. Talk about taking the high road. Goddamn. He refused to participate in every subsequent parole hearing as well, preferring to die. Oh, sorry. Larry refused to participate. He preferred to die in prison, and he did so on June the 10th, 2015, of natural causes at 65. Winnipeg criminal lawyer Hirsch Welch said to the media, "One doesn't like to speak ill of the dead, but in this case, it certainly is possible to speak good." Mwah. As for David Milgaard, after his release from prison in 1992, he suffered for a few years from mental illness and substance abuse. 23 years in prison took their toll. He would become disorientated in public, and so he was put on regular doses of lithium and other medications, which he stopped taking when he was drinking. This led to several scrapes with the law, but no trials and no jail time. He was once arrested for being drunk and disorderly in Vancouver for trying to rescue a woman from being manhandled on the street. It turns out the men manhandling her were cops. Similar incidents dotted his life on the outside until his marriage in 1996. Then he settled down and had 2 children, a son and a daughter. This is such a nice ending. Yes, Milgaard moved to the town of Cochrane, Alberta, near the city of Calgary. Milgaard spoke at numerous legal conferences over the years and became an advocate for the wrongly convicted. He took flying lessons alongside his mother, Joyce, and bought her an airplane. It's a rich person. I love it. He bought his lawyer, David Asper, a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Awesome. David Asper, a house though, mate. In November 2020, he started a YouTube channel, Project Milgaard, and posted 18 videos dealing with wrongful convictions and prisoners' rights. I had no idea. That's awesome. Sadly, David Milgaard died. No! On May the 15th, my birthday, 2022, after suffering complications from pneumonia, is 69. Oh, okay. Wow, yeah, that's true. This all was a very long time ago. So he was 69. Still way too young. My dad's 69, and he's not that old. I mean, he is. He's like old, but not. He's like not old. He's just like, old. Having spent almost exactly a third of his life behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. Dismembered appendices. In February 2023, a bill was introduced to the House of Commons known as the David and Joyce Milgaard's Law to create a revamped and permanent commission to investigate wrongful convictions in the Canadian justice system. It passed into law on December 17, 2024. The commission is headquartered in Winnipeg, where from 1980 to 1992, so much of David Milgaard's legal battle took place. Number 2. In addition to learning how to fly a plane, Joyce Milgaard was given an honorary doctorate of law by the University of Manitoba, was added to the honor roll of Maclean's magazine, and was awarded a commemorative medal by the Canadian government. She sat on the board of directors of several charity and advocacy foundations, and in 1999 became a best-selling author after publishing a book on her fight for her son's freedom. Joyce Milgaard died on March 21st, 2020 at 89 years old, 2 years before her son. Number 3. Shorty Cudrain continued to suffer from mental illness throughout the rest of his life. He died in a hunting accident in 1995 at 43 years old. 4. Ron Wilson, for admitting perjury to the Supreme Court of Canada in 1992, was cited for contempt of court. He again testified at the Milgaard inquiry in 2006. Beyond that, Wilson has sought refuge in obscurity. Good choice, Wilson. Number 5. Nickel John, now Demian, was again compelled to testify at the Milgaard inquiry in 2006, where she wore a dark wig and sunglasses as a disguise. She repeated the claim that she could not remember the murder or implicating Milgaard to police. She, too, has retreated back into obscurity. Another excellent choice. Number 6. The Saskatoon neighborhood where much of this story takes place is called Pleasant Hill. Saskatchewan is, in fact, an incredibly flat prairie province, leading to the endless repetition of the tired old joke that if your dog runs away, you can watch it for 3 days. That's clever. Tired old joke. It's a new joke to me, though. So it may not come as a total surprise to learn that Pleasant Hill is not, in fact, a hill. It's about as flat as the dialogue in a Hallmark film. That's also nice. Number 7. I was born and raised in Calgary, Alberta. David, who wrote the script, not me, which was featured a few times in this story. I remember seeing Larry Fisher's Calgary arrest on the news in 1997. Moreover, the town of Cochrane, where David Milgaard said, oh, that's impressive. David is I believe he's 87 as well, same age as me when he was born. I don't remember from the news in 1997. I do remember one piece of news, probably around 1997, about there was some sheep disease in the UK, and there was this thing called sheep dipping, and there is a reason why I remember this. It was because my uncle was interviewed about this for some reason. He's not a farmer, he's a doctor, but there was something to do with like it being a health concern, and he was on the news, and I remember being like, that's awesome. So that's the only news I remember from, got to be around 1997. Moreover, the town of Cochrane, where David Milgaard settled, also has an odd connection to me and my family. Starting in 1959, my great-grandfather and grandfather operated a lead shot plant there, manufacturing ammo for hunters and recreational shooters. Both my dad and I worked there in our youth. My dad, way more than me. What is notable about the plant is its odd appearance. It's a rickety wood shack atop a 181-foot tower that used to be an oil derrick, as if a tornado had picked up Dorothy's house and left it there. That's awesome. The reason for this was in order to cool the molten lead, it would be poured down the tower to the factory below, the air forming it into little droplets as if it was scorching hot metal rain. You can still find pictures of the Ronneby shot tower on Google. It was torn down in 2006, but for 47 years it dominated the Cochrane skyline as the town's most recognizable and utterly bizarre landmark. David Baker, Law Unlocked. Thank you, David. This was a fantastic script. A long script. Appreciate it. I hope you liked the episode. If you did, leave us a review if you're listening to this show as a podcast. Like us on YouTube. I'll see you next time.